The First Legion came into being during the final, brutal decades of the Unification Wars, when the Emperor of Mankind carved out his dominion from the warring techno-barbarian kingdoms of Terra. While the exact date of their founding remains obscured by the passage of millennia and the deliberate obfuscation of imperial records, what is known is that these warriors represented the first successful implementation of the Legion's Astartes project. They were not merely the first numbered legion, they were the template, the proof of concept that the Emperor's vision for transhuman warriors could be realized. Every gene seed organ, every implantation procedure, every aspect of hypno-doctrination that would later define the Space Marines was first tested and perfected within the bodies and minds of the First Legion's warriors. These proto-Astartes fought alongside the Emperor himself during Terra's final unification, participating in campaigns that saw the last holdouts of old Earth brought to compliance. The Thunder Warriors, those earlier and more unstable gene-enhanced soldiers, were already being phased out, and the First Legion represented the future of the Emperor's military ambitions. Unlike their predecessors, these warriors were built for longevity and stability, designed to prosecute wars not just across a single planet but across the stars themselves. They carried weapons that predated the Age of Strife, technologies recovered from the vaults beneath the Himalaysian mountains and the forge complexes of Mars. Plasma weapons, Volkite chargers, and graviton guns, armaments that would become increasingly rare as the millennia progressed, were standard issue for these first Space Marines. When the Emperor's gaze turned skyward and the Great Crusade began its expansion beyond the Sol system, the First Legion formed the spirit of humanity's reconquest of the galaxy. They fought without a Primarch for decades, led instead by senior commanders who had proven themselves during the Terran campaigns. These early expeditionary fleets encountered horrors that would have broken lesser forces, Xenos empires that had flourished during humanity's isolation, worlds twisted by warp exposure, and technological nightmares left over from the dark age of technology. The First Legion developed a reputation for absolute thoroughness in their prosecutions. When they declared a world compliant, nothing remained that could threaten the Imperium's hold. No Xenos survived to regroup, no corrupted technology remained functional, no pocket of resistance endured to fester into future rebellion. The world of Caliban lay shrouded in warp storms for much of the Age of Strife. Its human population regressed to a feudal state, dominated by massive forests inhabited by creatures known as the Great Beasts. These monsters defied easy classification. Some appeared to be products of uncontrolled mutation, others seemed almost demonic in nature, and all posed a lethal threat to human habitation. The knightly orders of Caliban had formed to protect the scattered fortress monasteries and settlements, conducting hunts into the forests that could last months and claim dozens of lives for a single beast slain. The greatest of these orders was simply called the Order, and it maintained the largest fortress monastery on the planet at Alduruk. The infant Primarch, who would become known as Lionel Johnson, arrived on Caliban in the same manner as his brothers, cast through the warp by forces that sought to deny the Emperor his greatest weapons. The child survived alone in the Death World forests for years, a feat that should have been impossible. He killed great beasts with his bare hands, learned to track and hunt without any human guidance, and developed an instinctive understanding of warfare that transcended anything that could be taught. When Knights of the Order finally discovered him during a hunt, they found a feral youth who moved through the forests like a ghost and had left a trail of dead monsters in his wake. The Knights brought the boy to Alduruk, where the Order's leaders undertook his education and civilization. The Primarch learned with frightening speed, absorbing knowledge of combat, strategy, history, and the knightly codes in a fraction of the time it took normal humans. Within a year, he had been given the name Lionel Johnson, the Lion, son of the forest, and had begun accompanying the Order's hunting parties. Within 5 years, he had risen to become one of the Order's foremost knights. Within 10, he had no equal on Caliban. Lionel Johnson revolutionized the war against the great beasts. Where previous generations had fought defensively, protecting settlements and reacting to beast attacks, the Lion advocated for systematic extermination campaigns. He organized the knightly orders into coordinated forces, established supply lines that allowed for extended operations deep in the forests, and personally led hunts that tracked great beasts to their lairs. His closest companion during this period was Luther, a knight who had been among those who first found him in the forest. Luther served as the lion's second in command and helped bridge the gap between the Primarch's sometimes inhuman efficiency and the traditions of Caliban's warrior culture. The hunts grew in scale and ambition. Entire regions of forest were cleared, with the knights establishing fortified positions and pushing deeper into territories that had been considered impassable. The lion demonstrated an uncanny ability to predict beast movements and identify vulnerabilities in creatures that had defied categorization for generations. Some of the greatest monsters of Caliban fell during this period. Creatures whose names had been used to frighten children for centuries were brought down by coordinated attacks that the lion planned with meticulous precision. When the Emperor's fleet finally reached Caliban, the world had been transformed. The great beasts, while not entirely extinct, had been pushed back to the deepest and most remote forests. Human civilization had expanded beyond its fortress monasteries, and the knightly orders had evolved into a planetary military force. The Emperor's recognition of his lost son was immediate, and the reunion between the lion and his gene father proceeded with less ceremony than some of the other Primarch discoveries. The lion understood what he was, what he had been created to be, and accepted his role without the doubt or resistance that characterized some of his brother's responses to their discovery. The First Legion received their Primarch with a mixture of anticipation and apprehension. These were warriors who had fought for decades without their gene father, who had developed their own traditions and methods. The Lion's integration into the Legion's command structure was not seamless. He brought with him knights from Caliban, warriors who had fought beside him against the great beasts, but who lacked the experience of void warfare and Xeno's extermination that defined the Legion's veterans. The solution was to establish Caliban as the Legion's primary recruitment world and to begin a process of cultural synthesis. The Order's traditions were incorporated wholesale into the First Legion structure. The concept of knightly honor, the emphasis on personal combat prowess, and the organizational frameworks of the Calibanite orders merged with the Legion's existing practices. New recruits from Caliban underwent the same trials their Primarch had championed: hunts in the remaining forests, tests of skill and courage against the surviving great beasts. Those who survived and proved worthy received the gene seed of the lion and began their transformation into Astartes. Luther remained on Caliban to oversee this process, establishing training regimens and ensuring that the world could supply a steady stream of warriors to the Legion's expeditionary fleets. The Dark Angels, as the Legion now called itself, took on an increasingly specialized role during the Great Crusade. The Emperor deployed them against threats that required not just military victory, but complete annihilation. Xeno's empires that had to be removed from the galaxy entirely, human civilizations so corrupted by forbidden technology or warp influence that they could never be brought to compliance, and threats that the Emperor deemed too dangerous to allow any possibility of resurgence. These became the Dark Angels' purview. They developed expertise in combined arms warfare that exceeded even the other Legion's capabilities, coordinating infantry assaults with armor columns, aerial strikes, and naval bombardments with a precision that left no room for enemy survival. The Legion's arsenal reflected their role as the Emperor's ultimate sanction. They maintained access to weapon systems that other legions rarely saw, technologies from the Dark Age that the Mechanicum released only to the most trusted forces. Plasma weapons of unusual sophistication, graviton cannons capable of crushing tanks into compressed cubes of metal, and void shields miniaturized to the point where individual squads could deploy them. The Dark Angels Techmarines worked closely with Forge Worlds that specialized in recovering and maintaining pre-Imperial technology, ensuring that the Legion could field equipment that gave them decisive advantages in the wars of extermination they prosecuted. The Lion proved to be one of the most effective Primarchs in terms of raw military achievement. He lacked Guilliman's administrative genius and Dorn's gift for fortification, but in the art of destroying the Emperor's enemies, few could match him. His campaigns were characterized by rapid strikes that identified and eliminated enemy command structures, followed by methodical sweeps that left nothing capable of regeneration. Worlds that resisted the Imperium's advance found themselves facing not occupation, but obliteration. The Lion made no apologies for this approach. He had been created to be a weapon, and he wielded himself with the same precision he applied to all his tools. The decision that would ultimately doom the Dark Angels came not from malice, but from strategic necessity, though the consequences would prove catastrophic regardless of intent. As the Great Crusade reached its apex and the Lion's reputation as a military commander grew, the demands on the Legion increased proportionally. Expeditionary fleets required constant reinforcement, new recruits needed training and indoctrination, and Caliban's role as the Legion's primary recruitment world meant maintaining a substantial presence there. The Lion made the choice to leave Luther behind as Lord Cipher of Caliban, tasked with overseeing recruitment, training new initiates, and managing the world's integration into the Imperium's administrative structure. Alongside Luther remained Zahariel, a librarian who had fought beside the Lion during the final hunts against the great beasts, and a significant portion of the Legion's strength, thousands of space marines who would garrison Caliban and train the next generation of Dark Angels. The warriors left behind represented a cross-section of the Legion, but patterns emerged that would later prove significant. Many were Calibanite in origin, knights who had joined the Legion during its early years after the Lion's discovery. Others were Terran-born veterans who had suffered injuries that made them less suitable for frontline combat, but who possessed invaluable experience for training purposes. Some were simply warriors the Lion deemed necessary for the garrison's strength. The official reasoning was sound. Caliban needed protection, recruits required experienced instructors, and the Legion's expansion demanded a robust logistical foundation. Yet the decision created an immediate divide between those who continued to fight alongside the Primarch across the galaxy and those relegated to what increasingly felt like a backwater posting. Luther himself had never undergone the full Astartes transformation. The biological augmentation process had limits, and Luther had been too old when the Emperor arrived on Caliban to receive the complete suite of gene seed implants. He had undergone partial enhancement, treatments that increased his strength and extended his lifespan but left him fundamentally less than a full space marine. This physical disparity, once irrelevant when he fought beside the Lion as brothers in the Order, became a source of private anguish. Luther watched warriors he had trained surpass him in capability, saw Astartes who looked to him for leadership while knowing he could never truly be one of them. The Lion's decision to leave him on Caliban felt like confirmation of inadequacy, regardless of the strategic justifications provided. The garrison's resentment grew slowly, fed by distance and isolation. Reports reached Caliban of the Dark Angels' victories, worlds brought to compliance, Xeno's empires exterminated, honors won in campaigns across the galaxy. Meanwhile, the warriors on Caliban drilled recruits, conducted administrative duties, and occasionally hunted the few remaining great beasts in forests that had been largely tamed. The contrast between the glory of the Great Crusade and the mundane reality of garrison duty created friction. Calibanite Marines felt they had been cast aside by their Primarch, left to rot on their homeworld, while Terran-born warriors fought at the Lion's side. Even those who understood the necessity of their posting found themselves questioning why they specifically had been chosen to remain behind. The taint came gradually, so subtle that none recognized it until corruption had already taken root. Caliban's forests had never been fully cleansed of the great beasts, and those creatures had always carried something wrong about them, a quality that defied natural explanation. The deepest forests, the places where even the Lion's systematic extermination campaigns had not reached, held secrets that predated human habitation. Warp contamination had seeped into Caliban during the Age of Strife, leaving marks on the world that mere military victory could not erase. The great beasts had been symptoms of this deeper corruption, and their near extinction had not removed the underlying cause. Zahariel and other librarians in the garrison began noticing anomalies. Psychic phenomena manifested with increasing frequency in the deep forests. Recruits who underwent trials in those regions sometimes returned changed in ways that transcended the normal psychological impact of facing death. The Watchers in the dark, mysterious robed figures who had appeared on Caliban after the Lion's arrival and attached themselves to the Legion grew more active and seemingly agitated. These diminutive beings, never speaking but somehow communicating their concerns, tried to warn of dangers that the Astartes could not yet perceive. Their warnings went largely unheeded. The Dark Angels had more immediate concerns with training schedules, equipment maintenance, and the endless administrative demands of running a Legion homeworld. Luther's fall was not a sudden plunge into damnation, but a gradual erosion of loyalty and faith. Doubt crept in during quiet moments, questions that had no satisfactory answers. Why had the Lion truly left him behind? Was it really about Caliban's needs, or was it because Luther represented a reminder of the Lion's past, a connection to a time before the Primarch had become the Emperor's weapon? The warriors around Luther voiced similar concerns, and their resentment found a receptive audience in their commander. Discussions that began as legitimate grievances about the garrison's role evolved into something darker. The Imperium's hypocrisy became a topic of conversation, how the Emperor preached enlightenment while prosecuting wars of extermination, how the Great Crusade claimed to unite humanity while destroying any culture that refused to conform. The corruption that infected the garrison did not announce itself with obvious signs. There were no sudden mutations, no overt demonic manifestations. Instead, the taint worked through psychology and emotion, amplifying existing doubts and resentments until they became all-consuming. Luther began to see himself as Caliban's true protector, the one who had remained loyal to their homeworld, while the Lion pursued glory across the stars. The warriors around him adopted similar perspectives, viewing themselves as defenders of Calibanic culture against the homogenizing influence of the Imperium. Secret societies formed within the garrison, warrior lodges that met in the deep forests and discussed matters they kept hidden from those they deemed still loyal to the distant Primarch. The War Master's rebellion, when news of it finally reached Caliban, arrived filtered through fragmentary reports and distorted by warp interference. The garrison learned that Horus had turned against the Emperor, that legions were fighting each other, that the Imperium was tearing itself apart in civil war. Luther's response was not immediate support for either side, but rather a calculation of Caliban's position. If the Imperium was destroying itself, if the Emperor's grand vision was collapsing into fratricide, then perhaps Caliban needed to chart its own course. The garrison began fortifying positions, stockpiling weapons, and preparing for a conflict they knew was inevitable, even if they could not yet articulate what form it would take. The Dark Angels themselves remained largely ignorant of Caliban's deterioration. The Lion prosecuted the Horus Heresy with his characteristic thoroughness, leading his legion against traitor forces and attempting to reach Terra before the final confrontation. The Dark Angels fought at Diamat, securing weapons that would prove crucial for the Loyalist cause. They pursued the Night Lords across the eastern fringe, engaging in a running battle that prevented Conrad Kerr's legion from reinforcing Horus. The Lion even confronted some of his traitorous brothers directly, engaging in the brutal politicking and warfare that characterized the heresy's middle years. Warp storms delayed the Dark Angels' return to the Sol system. These were not natural phenomena, but deliberate manipulations by forces that sought to keep the First Legion away from Terra during the crucial final battle. The Lion pushed his fleet through conditions that would have turned back less determined commanders, but even a Primarch could not simply will his ships through the Immaterium when the warp itself actively opposed him. Navigators went mad attempting to find routes through the storms. Geller fields strained under assault from entities that should not have been able to manifest so close to real space, and the fleet's progress slowed to a crawl. When the Dark Angels finally broke through the warp storms and received clear astropathic communication, the news was devastating. The siege of Terra had concluded. Horus was dead, slain by the Emperor aboard the Vengeful Spirit. The Emperor himself had been mortally wounded and now sat entombed on the Golden Throne, neither alive nor dead, but sustained in an eternal half-existence. The heresy was effectively over, though fighting continued across the galaxy as traitor forces retreated toward the Eye of Terror. The Dark Angels had missed the most important battle in human history, absent when the Imperium needed them most. The Lion's response was to turn the fleet toward Caliban. If they could not fight at Terra, they would return home, regroup, and prepare to hunt down the traitors who had escaped the Emperor's justice. The fleet emerged from the warp at the edge of the Caliban system, expecting to find their homeworld ready to receive them, to resupply and reinforce before launching new campaigns. Instead, they found the planet's orbital defenses active and targeting solutions being calculated for the approaching fleet. Attempts at communication received hostile responses. The garrison was not welcoming the Legion home. They were preparing to repel an invasion. Luther's message to the Lion was brief and uncompromising. Caliban would no longer serve the Imperium. The world and its garrison declared independence, rejecting the authority of both the Emperor and the Primarch. The Dark Angels who had remained behind had spent years preparing for this moment, fortifying Ald'Ruch and the other fortress monasteries, positioning orbital defense platforms, and indoctrinating themselves into believing they were defending their homeworld from tyranny. Luther had become something other than the knight who once fought beside the Lion in the forests. The corruption that had slowly infected the garrison had transformed him into a figure who genuinely believed he was acting righteously. The Lion's assault on Caliban was not a battle but an apocalypse. The Legion's fleet engaged orbital defenses, while drop pods and Thunderhawks delivered Astartes directly to the planet's surface. The fighting was immediate and brutal, Space Marines killing Space Marines in battles that raged across the fortress monasteries and through the forests that had once been the Order's hunting grounds. The garrison fought with desperate determination, knowing that defeat meant execution for treason. The Lion's forces attacked with the cold precision that characterized all their operations, systematically reducing defensive positions and pushing toward Ald'Ruch, where Luther had established his headquarters. The Primarch himself led the assault on Ald'Ruch, fighting through defenses that should have been impregnable. The fortress monastery had been designed to withstand sieges by great beasts and hostile human forces, but it had never been intended to resist a full Legion assault led by a Primarch. The Lion's forces breached the outer walls, then the inner sanctums, leaving a trail of dead Astartes in their wake. Brothers who had trained together, fought together, and sworn the same oaths killed each other in corridors and chambers that had witnessed the Order's greatest moments. The confrontation between the Lion and Luther took place in the deepest chambers of Ald'Ruch, in halls where the Order's grandmasters had once deliberated. The two warriors who had discovered a feral child in the forests and raised him to be Caliban's greatest knight now faced each other as enemies. Luther had been transformed by the corruption that infected him, enhanced by powers he should never have accessed, elevated beyond his partial Astartes augmentation into something that could challenge even a Primarch. The warp had given him strength in exchange for his soul, and he wielded that strength without hesitation. Their battle shattered the foundations of Ald'Ruch. Plasma bolts and power weapons carved through ancient stone, psychic energies manifested as visible distortions in reality, and the sheer physical force of their combat caused structural collapses throughout the fortress. Luther fought with skills he had never possessed before, channeling powers that burned through his body even as they allowed him to match the Lion's transhuman capabilities. The Primarch fought with the cold fury of a weapon that had been betrayed by those it was meant to protect, each strike intended to kill rather than disable. The warp storms came without warning, tearing through Caliban's atmosphere and striking the planet's surface with force that transcended mere weather. These were not natural phenomena, but manifestations of the Imperium itself, drawn to the psychic resonance of the battle between Primarch and corrupted champion. The storms ripped through the fortress monasteries, tore apart the forests, and cracked the planet's crust. Caliban began breaking apart, massive chunks of the world's surface torn free by forces that defied physical laws. The Dark Angels' fleet in orbit watched in horror as their homeworld died, unable to intervene against destruction operating on a scale beyond any weapon they possessed. The Lion struck Luther down in the final moments before the warp storms consumed Ald'Ruch entirely. The blow should have been fatal, but Luther survived long enough to unleash one final attack, a blast of psychic energy channeled through his dying body with enough force to mortally wound even a Primarch. The Lion fell, his body broken by powers that should never have touched him, and in that moment, the Watchers in the dark emerged from the shadows where they had been observing. These mysterious beings, who had attached themselves to the Dark Angels for reasons they never explained, gathered around the fallen Primarch and began dragging him deeper into the fortress even as it collapsed around them. The surviving Dark Angels searched desperately for their Primarch as Caliban tore itself apart. They found Luther, broken and insane, muttering about forgiveness and damnation in equal measure. They found no trace of the Lion. The Watchers in the Dark had taken him into depths beneath Ald'Ruch that the Legion had never known existed, chambers and passages that predated human habitation of Caliban. When the warp storms finally subsided and Caliban's destruction stabilized, all that remained of the world was a massive chunk of rock that contained the ruins of Ald'Ruch and the hidden chambers beneath. This fragment, which the Dark Angels would name the Rock, became their new fortress monastery and mobile base of operations. The warp storms that destroyed Caliban did more than tear a world apart. They scattered the traitor garrison across space and time itself. The Imperium operates by rules that defy conventional physics, and when the storms ripped through the planet's surface, they caught thousands of Dark Angels in their grip and cast them into the warp's chaotic currents. These warriors, who would become known as the Fallen, did not experience a simple journey through the warp. Instead, they were dispersed across 10,000 years of Imperial history, emerging at different points in the timeline with no control over when or where they would return to real space. Some materialized in the decades immediately following the heresy, while others would not appear until the 41st millennium. The warp's temporal distortions meant that a Fallen who had been a newly inducted Space Marine during the battle on Caliban might emerge centuries later, having experienced only moments of subjective time, while another veteran of the Great Crusade could appear having lived through decades of warp time that had driven him to the edge of madness. The Dark Angels' first encounter with surviving Fallen came within a decade of Caliban's destruction. A patrol fleet investigating disturbances in the Perditus sector detected an automated distress beacon using Legion codes that should have been obsolete. The responding force found a damaged strike cruiser drifting in the void, its systems barely functional, and its hull scarred by what appeared to be warp exposure. Aboard were 17 Dark Angels, who claimed to have been fighting on Caliban mere hours before, despite the fact that years had passed since the planet's destruction. These warriors wore the heraldry of the garrison, and their gene seed authenticated them as genuine Dark Angels. Their leader demanded to know why the fleet was firing on them, apparently unaware that the battle for Caliban had concluded or that they had been declared traitors. The interrogation that followed revealed the terrible scope of what had happened. The Fallen claimed they had been defending Caliban from an unjust assault, that Luther had been protecting their homeworld from the Imperium's tyranny. They spoke of the Lion as a tyrant who had abandoned them, of the Emperor as a despot who demanded absolute obedience. Some showed signs of warp corruption, mutations that had not yet fully manifested, psychic abilities that no Dark Angel should possess, or a disturbing charisma that suggested demonic influence. Others appeared to be genuine Space Marines who had been caught up in Luther's rebellion without fully understanding what they were doing. The questioning proceeded for weeks, conducted by the Legion's chaplains and librarians in secure facilities where the Fallen could not communicate with anyone outside their cells. The senior commanders of the Dark Angels faced a choice that would define their chapter for the next 10 millennia. They possessed evidence that a significant portion of their Legion had turned traitor, that thousands of their brothers had fought against the Imperium during the heresy. The Fallen represented proof that the First Legion had been compromised, that the Dark Angels were no different from the traitor legions that had followed Horus into damnation. If this information reached the wider Imperium, if the Inquisition learned that Dark Angels had declared independence from the Emperor and fought against their own Primarch, the consequences would be catastrophic. The Legion would be declared excommunicate traitoris, their gene seed would be destroyed, and every Dark Angel would be hunted down and executed for the sins of their brothers. The decision to maintain absolute secrecy was not made lightly, but it was made with the same thoroughness that characterized all Dark Angels' operations. The fallen prisoners were transferred to the deepest cells within the rock, chambers that had been discovered in the ruins beneath what had once been Ald'Ruch. These dungeons existed in sections of the fortress monastery that predated human habitation of Caliban, spaces that the Watchers in the Dark seemed to have prepared specifically for this purpose. The 17 fallen disappeared from all records, their existence known only to the chapter's senior leadership. The strike cruiser that had carried them was stripped of anything useful and then destroyed, its wreckage scattered across multiple systems to prevent anyone from tracing its origin. The Dark Angels established protocols for dealing with future fallen encounters. Any information about traitors within the Legion would be classified at the highest level, accessible only to the inner circle, the chapter's senior officers who had been inducted into the Supreme Secret. These warriors, upon learning the truth, underwent psychological conditioning to ensure they could maintain the deception, even under psychic interrogation. The inner circle expanded to include not just the chapter master and his immediate subordinates, but also the masters of the specialized companies that would be tasked with hunting the fallen. The Death Wing, the chapter's first company of Terminator armored veterans, became the chamber militant of this secret war. The Raven Wing, the second company that specialized in high-speed warfare and reconnaissance, would serve as hunters who tracked down leads and confirmed fallen sightings before the Death Wing deployed for capture operations. The psychological burden of learning the truth broke some warriors entirely. Space Marines were conditioned to be loyal beyond question, indoctrinated from their recruitment to believe in the Imperium's righteousness and their chapter's honor. Discovering that thousands of their brothers had turned traitor, that the Dark Angels carried a shame so profound it could destroy them, created a cognitive dissonance that some could not reconcile. There were cases of newly inducted Inner Circle members who took their own lives rather than live with the knowledge. Others became obsessed with hunting the fallen to the point of neglecting all other duties, pursuing rumors and half-confirmed reports across the galaxy while their assigned responsibilities went unfulfilled. The chapter's chaplains developed specialized counseling techniques to help warriors process the revelation without losing their sanity or effectiveness. The crisis of faith extended beyond simple shock at the existence of traitors. Many Dark Angels who learned the truth began questioning everything they had been taught about their chapter's history. If the Legion had harbored traitors of this magnitude, what else had been concealed? The official histories claimed the Dark Angels had been absent from the Siege of Terra due to warp storms, but was that the complete truth or a convenient simplification? Had the Lion known about the corruption spreading through the Caliban garrison and failed to act? These questions had no satisfactory answers, and the uncertainty gnawed at warriors who had built their entire identities on the foundation of being part of the First Legion. The Unforgiven, the term that came to encompass not just the Dark Angels, but also their successor chapters, developed an organizational culture centered entirely on redemption. Every action, every campaign, every decision was evaluated through the lens of whether it brought them closer to capturing all the fallen and finally purging their shame. This obsession manifested in ways that sometimes conflicted with the Imperium's broader strategic needs. Dark Angels forces would abandon battlefields mid-campaign if they received intelligence about fallen sightings, leaving Allied forces without support and objectives incomplete. The chapter became notorious for refusing to explain their actions to outsiders, citing operational security and chapter privileges that dated back to the First Legion's founding. Imperial commanders learned to be wary of requesting Dark Angels' assistance, knowing that the Astartes might disappear without warning if their own agenda took precedence. The lengths to which the Unforgiven would go to prevent their secret's revelation knew virtually no limits. There were documented cases of Dark Angels firing on Imperial Guard units who had witnessed Fallen in action, eliminating entire regiments to ensure no survivors could report what they had seen. Inquisitors who investigated too closely into Dark Angels' activities sometimes disappeared, their deaths arranged to look like accidents or attributed to Xeno's action. The chapter maintained an extensive intelligence network that monitored inquisitorial communications, looking for any indication that someone was getting too close to the truth. When necessary, the Dark Angels would deploy their most skilled operatives to retrieve or destroy evidence, conducting operations that technically constituted treason against the Imperium they claimed to serve. The Fallen themselves exhibited enormous variation in their corruption and motivations. Some had embraced chaos worship fully, bearing mutations and wielding demonic powers that marked them as irredeemable. These warriors had spent subjective centuries in the warp, experiencing horrors and revelations that transformed them into monsters wearing dark angels' colors. Others remained relatively uncorrupted, having emerged from the warp shortly after being scattered, and spent the intervening years simply trying to survive in an Imperium that would execute them if their origins became known. These fallen often had no memory of fighting against the Lion, their last clear recollections being of defending Caliban against what they perceived as an unjust assault. The interrogator chaplains who questioned captured fallen had to determine not just what each prisoner knew, but also what they had become during their time scattered across space and time. The interrogation process itself represented one of the darkest aspects of the Unforgiven's obsession. Captured fallen were taken to the rock's deepest dungeons and subjected to techniques that would have horrified even the Inquisition's most zealous members. The interrogator chaplains used a combination of physical torture, psychic manipulation, and theological argumentation to break their prisoners. The goal was not simply to extract information, but to force the fallen to repent, to acknowledge their treason and beg forgiveness before they died. A fallen who repented was granted the Emperor's peace, a quick death, and the assurance that his gene seed would be cleansed and returned to service. Those who refused to repent faced torment that could last decades, kept alive through a combination of Astartes' physiology and life support systems that prevented them from escaping through death. The supreme irony of the Dark Angels' situation was that their obsessive secrecy and willingness to commit questionable acts in pursuit of the fallen made them appear more suspicious than if they had simply revealed the truth. The Inquisition maintained extensive files on the Dark Angels and their successors, documenting instances where the chapters had behaved in ways that suggested they were hiding something significant. Multiple inquisitors had attempted to investigate the Unforgiven thoroughly, only to encounter stonewalling, misdirection, and in some cases outright hostility. The Dark Angels' insistence on maintaining their secrets at any cost created exactly the kind of behavior that the Inquisition was designed to investigate, trapping the chapter in a cycle where their attempts to hide their shame made them look more guilty of some unknown transgression. The successor chapters created from Dark Angels' gene seed inherited both the genetic legacy and the terrible burden of the fallen. The Angels of Absolution, Angels of Redemption, Angels of Vengeance, and others all maintained their own inner circles and conducted their own hunts for the fallen. These chapters coordinated with the Dark Angels through encrypted communications and clandestine meetings, sharing intelligence about fallen sightings and jointly planning capture operations. The Unforgiven operated as a legion in all but name, maintaining a level of coordination between chapters that technically violated the Codex Astartes' restrictions on space marine organization. This too represented a risk. If the Inquisition discovered that multiple chapters were operating as a unified force under Dark Angels' leadership, it would trigger investigations that could uncover the truth about the fallen. The rock itself became the physical manifestation of the Dark Angels' burden and their determination to achieve redemption. The fragment of Caliban that survived the planet's destruction contained not just the ruins of Alderac, but also the hidden chambers where the Lion had been taken by the Watchers in the dark. The Dark Angels searched for their Primarch in the decades following the heresy, exploring passages and rooms that seemed to shift and change when no one was watching. They never found him, but they discovered other things in those depths, artifacts from Caliban's pre-human history, chambers that seemed to have been prepared specifically for containing the fallen, and the continued presence of the Watchers in the dark, who served the chapter in ways that no one fully understood. The rock became a mobile fortress monastery, equipped with warp drives that allowed it to travel across the galaxy in pursuit of the fallen, carrying the chapter's shame and its determination to purge that shame through 10,000 years of obsessive hunting. The fragment of Caliban that survived the planet's destruction measured hundreds of kilometers across, a massive chunk of rock that contained the ruins of Alderac and the labyrinthine depths beneath it. The Dark Angels claimed this fragment as their fortress monastery, naming it simply the Rock, and began the process of transforming it into a mobile base of operations capable of traversing the galaxy. Techmarines and engineers from Mars worked for decades to install the necessary systems, plasma reactors powerful enough to sustain a city-sized structure in the void warp drives that could move something of such enormous mass through the Imperium void shields that created protective barriers against both conventional weapons and the hazards of space travel. The exterior was fortified with armor-plating meters thick defense laser batteries that could engage enemy vessels at extreme range, and launch bays for the chapter's fleet of strike cruisers and smaller craft. The rock's interior defied conventional architectural logic. The ruins of Alduruk occupied the upper levels, their shattered halls and chambers rebuilt and repurposed into command centers, training facilities, armories, and living quarters for the chapter's warriors. Below these reconstructed sections lay passages and rooms that had survived Caliban's destruction intact, their ancient stone walls bearing carvings that predated human settlement of the world. These deeper levels formed a maze of corridors that twisted back on themselves, staircases that led to chambers at impossible angles, and doors that opened onto spaces larger than should have been able to fit within the rock's physical dimensions. Dark angels who ventured into these depths without proper guidance sometimes disappeared for days, emerging disoriented and unable to accurately describe the route they had taken. The deepest levels of the rock contained the dungeons where captured fallen were imprisoned and interrogated. These cells existed in sections that the chapter's techmarines could not explain through conventional engineering, chambers carved from rock that seemed older than Caliban itself, with walls that absorbed sound and light in ways that defied measurement. The dungeons were arranged in a descending hierarchy, with the least corrupted fallen held in the upper cells where they received relatively humane treatment, while those who had fully embraced chaos occupied the lowest levels where the barriers between reality and the warp grew thin. The interrogator chaplains who worked in these depths reported phenomena that suggested the rock itself was somehow alive or at least aware, passages that changed configuration between visits, cells that seemed to know what form of confinement would most effectively contain their occupants, and a persistent sense of being observed by entities that remained just beyond perception. The Watchers in the dark maintained a constant presence in the rock's deepest sections. These diminutive robed figures, standing barely waist-high to a human, moved through the fortress monastery with apparent freedom, despite the Dark Angel's extensive security measures. They appeared in chambers that should have been sealed, observed interrogations from shadows that contained no obvious hiding places, and occasionally intervened in ways that suggested they possessed knowledge they lacked. The Watchers never spoke, communicating through gestures when they communicated at all, and their faces remained hidden beneath their hoods. Attempts to study them proved futile. They simply vanished when approached too aggressively, and any equipment used to scan them produced readings that made no sense. The chapter's librarians reported that the Watchers registered as blanks in the warp, creating voids in the psychic background that should have been impossible for entities that clearly possessed some form of consciousness. The Watchers' origins remained a mystery that the Dark Angels had pursued for 10,000 years without resolution. They had appeared on Caliban after the Lion's arrival, emerging from the deepest forests where the great beasts had been most numerous. Some in the chapter theorized they were Xenos who had inhabited Caliban before humanity, while others suggested they might be artificial constructs created by some long-dead civilization. The most disturbing theory, whispered only among the highest ranks of the inner circle, was that the Watchers were somehow connected to the warp corruption that had infected Caliban's forests, that they represented something that existed in the spaces between the Materium and the Immaterium. Whatever their nature, the Watchers had demonstrated absolute loyalty to the Dark Angels, intervening at crucial moments to protect the chapter or guide them toward captured fallen. They had saved the Lion after his battle with Luther, dragging the mortally wounded Primarch into depths that the chapter had never been able to relocate, and they continued to serve as guardians of secrets that even the Inner Circle did not fully understand. The Inner Circle itself represented the organizational structure through which the Dark Angels maintained their supreme secret. At its apex sat the Supreme Grand Master, the chapter master who bore ultimate responsibility for both the chapter's military operations and the hunt for the fallen. Below him served the Grand Masters who commanded the specialized companies, the Master of the Death Wing, who led the first company's Terminator armored veterans, the Master of the Raven Wing, who directed the second company's high-speed reconnaissance and strike operations, and the Masters of the Battle companies, who prosecuted the chapter's conventional warfare obligations. These officers formed the core of the Inner Circle, the warriors who possessed complete knowledge of the fallen and the authority to make decisions about how the hunt would be conducted. Induction into the Inner Circle proceeded through a series of revelations that gradually exposed a warrior to the full truth. A dark angel who had proven himself through decades of service might be promoted to sergeant and given command of a tactical squad, at which point he would receive the first hints that the chapter harbored secrets beyond the official histories. He might be told that some dark angels had been lost during the heresy, scattered by warp storms and presumed dead, and that the chapter maintained a standing order to investigate any reports of space marines matching certain descriptions. This partial truth served as a test. Officers observed how the sergeant processed this information, whether he could maintain operational security and continue to function effectively while carrying knowledge that contradicted what he had been taught as a scout. Further promotions brought deeper revelations. A sergeant who distinguished himself might be elevated to command a company, at which point he would learn that the lost Dark Angels were not simply missing, but had turned traitor. The newly promoted captain would be shown evidence, records of fallen encounters, interrogation transcripts, and historical documents that proved thousands of Dark Angels had fought against the Lion on Caliban. This revelation typically provoked a crisis that the chapter's chaplains had to manage carefully. Some captains refused to believe the evidence initially, insisting it must be falsified or misinterpreted. Others experienced rage at having been deceived for so long, anger that had to be channeled into productive determination rather than allowed to fester into resentment. The psychological conditioning that followed induction into the Inner Circle took months, during which the newly enlightened warrior underwent intensive counseling and training in the techniques necessary to maintain the deception. The full Inner Circle, those who possessed complete knowledge and authority to make strategic decisions about the hunt, numbered perhaps 24 warriors across the entire chapter. These were the officers who knew not just that the fallen existed, but also the full scope of the threat they represented, that there were thousands scattered across space and time, that some had become powerful chaos champions, and that the mere existence of the fallen could destroy the Dark Angels if the Inquisition learned the truth. These warriors met in chambers deep within the rock, rooms that were shielded against psychic observation, and swept for surveillance devices before each gathering. They reviewed intelligence reports from across the galaxy, coordinated with successor chapters about joint operations, and made decisions that sometimes contradicted the Imperium's strategic priorities in favor of the hunt. The burden of leadership within the Inner Circle manifested in ways both obvious and subtle. Supreme Grand Masters aged visibly under the weight of their responsibilities, their faces becoming lined and haggard despite the biological advantages of Astartes' physiology. They made decisions that resulted in the deaths of loyal Imperial forces, ordering Dark Angels to abandon battlefields or even fire on allies to prevent the Fallen's existence from being revealed. They authorized interrogation techniques that would have appalled the chapter's rank and file, methods that pushed the boundaries of what could be justified even in the grim darkness of the 41st millennium. The knowledge that they were committing acts that bordered on treason, all in service of protecting the chapter from the consequences of a betrayal that happened 10,000 years ago, created a psychological burden that never lessened regardless of how long a warrior served in the Inner Circle. The interrogator chaplains who worked in the Rock's dungeons represented a specialized branch of the chapter's spiritual leadership. These warriors combined the traditional chaplain's role as keeper of faith and morale with expertise in interrogation, torture, and psychological manipulation. They studied the fallen obsessively, learning to recognize the signs of chaos corruption and developing techniques for breaking through the mental defenses that traitor space marines erected. An interrogator chaplain might spend decades working with a single fallen prisoner, conducting sessions that lasted for hours and employing methods that ranged from theological debate to physical torment. The goal was always the same: to force the fallen to acknowledge their treason, to repent sincerely, and to beg the emperor's forgiveness before being granted the mercy of death. The interrogation chambers contained equipment that would have been more appropriate in an inquisitorial fortress than a space marine monastery. Neural whips that could inflict agony without causing physical damage, psychic amplifiers that allowed librarians to invade a prisoner's mind and extract memories directly, and life support systems that kept subjects alive even as their bodies failed under the strain of prolonged torture. The interrogator chaplains justified these methods through elaborate theological reasoning. The fallen had betrayed the emperor and the primarch, crimes so severe that any suffering inflicted upon them was righteous. A fallen who repented demonstrated that some spark of loyalty remained in their soul, proof that the emperor's light could penetrate even the deepest corruption. Those who refused to repent after years of interrogation were considered beyond redemption, their continued existence serving only as opportunities for the interrogator chaplains to refine their techniques. The psychological toll on the interrogator chaplains themselves was immense. These warriors spent their entire service surrounded by traitors, listening to justifications for betrayal and arguments against the Imperium that sometimes contained uncomfortable truths. They witnessed the depths of chaos corruption firsthand, saw what their own brothers had become after exposure to the warp's influence, and had to maintain their own faith while systematically destroying the faith of others. The chapter's leadership monitored interrogator chaplains closely for signs of corruption or psychological breakdown, rotating them out of the dungeons periodically to serve in more conventional roles and provide psychological relief from the constant exposure to darkness. The Rock's command centers coordinated not just the Dark Angel's operations, but also the activities of all the Unforgiven successor chapters. Encrypted communications arrived constantly from across the galaxy, reporting fallen sightings or requesting assistance with capture operations. The chapter maintained detailed records of every known fallen, tracking their movements across 10,000 years and building profiles that documented their capabilities, corruption level, and known associates. These records occupied entire data vaults within the Rock, their contents accessible only to the inner circle and protected by security measures that included both technological safeguards and psychic wards. The loss of these records would be catastrophic, potentially allowing Fallen to operate without the Unforgiven's knowledge and making it impossible to coordinate the hunt effectively. The Watchers in the Dark served as guardians of the Rock's most sensitive areas, appearing to prevent unauthorized access to chambers that contained evidence of the Fallen or secrets about the chapter's history. They seemed to possess an instinctive understanding of what needed to be protected, intervening to stop even high-ranking Dark Angels from entering certain sections if those warriors had not been fully inducted into the inner circle. Their methods of prevention varied. Sometimes they simply stood in doorways, their diminutive forms somehow preventing Space Marines from passing, while other times they caused equipment failures or created psychic disturbances that made areas temporarily inaccessible. The chapter had learned through 10 millennia of experience that attempting to force past the Watchers' restrictions inevitably failed, and that the mysterious being's judgment about who should access what information had never proven wrong. The Deathwing stands apart from every other Space Marine company in the Imperium, not merely in their tactical role or equipment, but in the burden they carry and the secrets they guard. While other chapters maintain first companies composed of veterans who have earned the right to wear tactical dreadnought armor, the Deathwing represents something more fundamental to the Dark Angel's identity. Every warrior who joins their ranks has been fully inducted into the inner circle, granted complete knowledge of the Fallen and the shame that drives the Unforgiven's 10,000-year hunt. These are not simply the chapter's most experienced warriors, they are the keepers of the supreme secret, the executioners who deploy when rumors of traitor Dark Angels surface, and the living embodiment of the chapter's determination to achieve redemption regardless of cost. The composition of the Deathwing reflects this unique position within the chapter's hierarchy. Unlike standard first companies that might field a mix of Terminator armored veterans and specialized units, the Deathwing consists entirely of warriors clad in tactical dreadnought armor. These suits, relics from the Heresy era and earlier, provide protection that can withstand punishment that would obliterate power-armored Marines. The thick ceramite plating can turn aside anti-tank weapons, the built-in power fields generate additional protective barriers, and the reinforced exoskeletons allow warriors to carry heavy weapons that would require crew-served mountings in standard infantry formations. Each suit represents a significant investment of resources and maintenance, requiring specialized care from the chapter's tech marines and periodic returns to Forge worlds for major repairs or system upgrades. The Deathwing's tactical doctrine centers on teleportarium assault, a method of deployment that other chapters employ sparingly due to its inherent risks. Teleportation technology operates by translating matter through the warp, disassembling a subject at the molecular level, transmitting those molecules through the Imperium, and reassembling them at the destination coordinates. The process takes only seconds from the perspective of outside observers, but for those being teleported, there exists a moment of awareness while suspended in the warp, a fraction of time where consciousness persists without a body, exposed to the touch of entities that hunger for mortal souls. Terminator armor's heavy shielding and built-in protective wards reduce the danger, but teleportation remains fundamentally hazardous. Warriors sometimes emerge with their armor fused to their flesh, their minds damaged by momentary contact with the warp's horrors, or in rare catastrophic failures, not at all. The Deathwing accepts these risks because teleportarium assault provides capabilities that justify the danger. They can deploy directly into enemy command centers, materializing inside fortifications that would take days to breach through conventional assault. They can board enemy vessels in void combat, appearing on bridges or engineering sections, and eliminating crews before defensive measures can respond. Most critically for their primary mission, they can respond to fallen sightings with a speed that prevents their targets from escaping. When the Ravenwing confirms a fallen's location and determines that immediate action is necessary, the Deathwing can deploy from the rock or supporting strike cruisers within minutes, appearing in the target's vicinity before any warning can be given. The bone-white color scheme that distinguishes the Deathwing from the dark green of the standard battle companies originated from a legend that predates the Heresy, a tale from Caliban's history that took on new meaning after the betrayal. The story tells of Cloud Runner, a warrior of the Plains world who returned to his homeworld after fighting alongside the Dark Angels during the Great Crusade. He found his people under assault by a genestealer infestation, the Xenos having infiltrated the population and begun the process of preparing the world for a Tyrannid Hive fleet's arrival. Cloud Runner and a handful of Dark Angels who accompanied him painted their armor in the white ash of their funeral pyres, symbolizing that they were already dead and fought only to take as many enemies with them as possible. They cleansed the infestation through weeks of brutal combat, hunting down every hybrid and pure-strain genestealer until none remained. When other Dark Angels arrived to investigate why the warriors had missed their scheduled communications, they found the Plains world purged of Xenos, but Cloud Runner and his brothers dead, their white armor stained with alien blood and their own. The Deathwing adopted this color scheme as a permanent reminder of sacrifice and the willingness to give everything in service of the mission. Every warrior who joins the first company participates in a ritual where they personally repaint their armor from dark green to bone white, a process that takes days and serves as meditation on what they have learned about the fallen. The white represents death, not the death they will inflict on the chapter's enemies, but their own metaphorical death as warriors who carry knowledge that separates them irrevocably from their brothers in the battle companies. They paint themselves as walking corpses, already committed to a hunt that will consume their entire existence and may never be completed within their lifetimes. The psychological impact of induction into the Deathwing extends beyond the revelation about the fallen that all Inner Circle members experience. These warriors must confront the reality that they will spend the remainder of their service hunting their own brothers, that they may be called upon to kill dark angels who bear the same gene seed and swore the same oaths. They train in techniques specifically designed for combating traitor Astartes, studying the fighting styles that the Legion employed during the Great Crusade and learning to counter the advantages that chaos corruption might provide their targets. This training includes exposure to the kinds of mutations and psychic abilities that corrupted Fallen might manifest, preparing them for enemies who can move with unnatural speed, shrug off wounds that should be fatal, or employ sorcery that violates the laws of physics. The Deathwing's equipment reflects their specialized role and the chapter's willingness to provide them with the best weapons available. Storm Bolters, the standard armament for Terminator armored warriors, fire mass reactive rounds at a rate that can shred infantry formations and suppress heavier targets. Power Fists crackle with disruptive energy fields that can punch through tank armor or crush enemy warriors inside their protective suits. Assault cannons spin up to firing speeds that transform them into rotary weapons capable of sustained fire that rivals vehicle-mounted systems. Cyclone missile launchers, mounted on the shoulders of Terminator suits, provide anti-armor capability and allow the Deathwing to engage targets at ranges beyond their standard weapons' effective distances. Beyond these standard armaments, the Deathwing maintains access to weapons that other chapters rarely see. Plasma cannons that can melt through fortress walls, heavy flamers that project streams of burning promethium across entire corridors, and chain fists whose whirring teeth can cut through bulkheads or the armor plating of enemy vehicles. The chapter's armory contains relics from the Great Crusade era, weapons that bear the personal heraldry of warriors who fought alongside the Lion, whose machine spirits have been awakened and maintained across 10,000 years. These weapons are assigned to squad sergeants and veterans who have proven themselves in combat against the fallen, physical symbols of the chapter's history and the unbroken chain of warriors who have pursued redemption. The Deathwing Knights represent an elite within an elite, veterans selected from the first company who have demonstrated not just martial prowess but absolute psychological resilience and unwavering loyalty to the Inner Circle's mission. These warriors form the personal guard of the Supreme Grand Master and serve as champions of the Inner Circle, deploying when the most dangerous Fallen are encountered or when operations require warriors who can be trusted with the most sensitive aspects of the hunt. The Knights wear modified Terminator armor, decorated with the robes and heraldry of Caliban's ancient knightly orders, visual links to the chapter's origins that remind them of the traditions they defend and the honor that was betrayed on their homeworld. The weapons carried by the Deathwing Knights reflect their status and the specialized nature of their role. Maces of Absolution, power weapons shaped like the ceremonial maces carried by Caliban's knight commanders, generate disruption fields strong enough to shatter armor and pulp flesh with single strikes. These weapons are particularly effective against heavily armored opponents, their impact force multiplied by the power fields to levels that can stagger even other Terminators. Flails of the Unforgiven, chain weapons whose heads contain multiple whirring blades, can strike multiple targets in a single attack or focus their cutting power against a single opponent to devastating effect. The Knights practice with these weapons for decades before being deemed ready for combat deployment, mastering techniques that allow them to fight in the confined spaces where Fallen are often cornered while avoiding injury to their battle brothers. The Deathwing Knights' most distinctive feature is their storm shields, massive protective barriers that can withstand fire that would destroy lesser defenses. These shields incorporate technology that dates back to the Dark Age of technology, generating layered energy fields that dissipate incoming attacks across multiple defensive planes. A Deathwing Knight can advance through fire that would force standard Terminators to seek cover, their shields absorbing plasma bolts and melta beams while they close with enemies. In formation, the Knights present an advancing wall of protection that allows other Deathwing squads to maneuver under cover of their shields, creating tactical flexibility that transforms the first company from a purely offensive force into one capable of both assault and defensive operations. The deployment patterns of the Deathwing reflect the dual nature of their mission. they must fulfill the chapter's obligations to the Imperium while remaining ready to respond immediately to any fallen sighting. This creates operational tensions that the chapter's leadership must constantly manage. A Deathwing squad might be assigned to support a campaign against an Orc invasion, providing heavy assault capability that proves decisive in breaching enemy fortifications, when intelligence arrives about a possible fallen presence 3 sectors away. The squad will be recalled immediately, often without explanation, to the Imperial commanders who were depending on their support. The Dark Angels have developed a reputation for these sudden departures, and other Imperial forces have learned to plan operations with the assumption that Dark Angels' support might vanish without warning. The Deathwing's quarters within the rock-occupy sections, adjacent to the dungeons where captured fallen are held, a deliberate arrangement that ensures the First Company remains constantly aware of their primary mission. These warriors live surrounded by the evidence of their chapter's shame. They hear the screams of fallen undergoing interrogation. They witness the interrogator chaplains emerging from sessions with blood on their armor, and they know that the prisoners in those cells are their own brothers corrupted by the same forces that could potentially claim any Dark Angel. This proximity to the chapter's darkest secrets serves as continuous motivation and reminder of what failure in their mission would mean. The psychological profile required for service in the Deathwing differs from what other chapters seek in their First Company veterans. The Dark Angels need warriors who can maintain absolute operational security even under extreme stress, who possess the mental discipline to carry knowledge that contradicts everything they were taught as scouts and neophytes, and who can kill their own brothers without hesitation when the mission demands it. The chapter's chaplains and librarians conduct extensive psychological evaluations before recommending warriors for promotion to the Deathwing, looking for specific traits that indicate a Marine can handle the burden. Some of the chapter's most skilled warriors never advance to the First Company because they lack the psychological resilience necessary, remaining in battle companies where they serve with distinction but never learn the full truth about the fallen. The Deathwing maintains its own fleet of strike cruisers and support vessels, allowing them to operate independently of the main chapter when necessary. These ships are configured specifically for rapid response operations, their warp drives maintained at higher readiness levels than standard chapter vessels, and their teleportariums kept in constant operational status. The fleet's crews are drawn from chapter serfs who have proven their loyalty and discretion, often descendants of families that have served the Dark Angels for generations. These mortals know they serve a chapter with secrets, and while they are not inducted into the inner circle, they understand that what they witness during operations must never be discussed outside the fleet. The Ravenwing operates as the Dark Angels' reconnaissance force and rapid strike element, but this description fails to capture the true nature of their role within the chapter's hierarchy. While other Space Marine chapters maintain scout companies or fast attack elements, the Ravenwing exists as a fully realized formation dedicated entirely to high-speed warfare, composed exclusively of bike squadrons, land speeders, and aircraft. No other chapter in the Adeptus Astartes fields a company structured in this manner. The tactical doctrine of most Space Marine forces treats bikes and speeders as supporting elements distributed across multiple companies, but the Dark Angels concentrate these assets into a single formation that operates with a unity of purpose and tactical flexibility unmatched anywhere else in the Imperium. The Second Company's organization reflects decades of refinement following the Heresy, when the Dark Angels recognized they needed dedicated hunters capable of pursuing leads across entire sectors and responding to fallen sightings before their targets could disappear into the galaxy's vastness. Standard Space Marine companies, built around tactical squads supported by specialist elements, lacked the speed necessary for this mission. The Ravenwing solved this problem by eliminating anything that would slow them down. Every warrior in the company rides to battle, whether on bikes that can cross continents in hours, land speeders that skim above terrain at speeds conventional vehicles cannot match, or aircraft that provide both reconnaissance capability and devastating close air support. The bikes themselves represent significant technological investments, each one a product of the chapter's forge, and maintained to standards that exceed even the Dark Angel's usual requirements for equipment care. These are not the simple two-wheeled conveyances that some Imperial forces employ for basic transportation. A Ravenwing bike incorporates anti-grav technology that reduces its effective weight, allowing it to achieve speeds that would tear apart conventional motorcycles, and enabling it to traverse terrain that would stop wheeled vehicles entirely. The engines produce thrust through a combination of conventional combustion and plasma acceleration, their output carefully balanced to provide both raw speed and the maneuverability necessary for combat operations. Weapons mounts integrate twin-linked bolters into the bike's frame, synchronized to the rider's targeting systems, and capable of laying down suppressive fire while the warrior maintains full control of his vehicle. Ravenwing Marines train for years before being deemed ready for combat deployment with the Second Company. The skills required go far beyond what standard Space Marine training provides. A warrior must learn to fight while moving at speeds where reaction times are measured in fractions of seconds, where a moment's inattention means collision with obstacles or enemy fire. They practice shooting while their bikes accelerate, brake, and corner at velocities that would disorient unaugmented humans. The training includes high-speed pursuit scenarios, where squads hunt targets across varied terrain, learning to coordinate their movements and maintain formation integrity, even when individual warriors must deviate from planned routes to avoid hazards. Veterans of the Ravenwing develop an almost supernatural awareness of their surroundings, processing visual information and making tactical decisions faster than warriors who fight on foot. The land speeders that support the bike squadrons provide firepower that individual Marines cannot carry while maintaining the mobility the company requires. These anti-grav vehicles hover on repulsor fields, skimming across battlefields at speeds that match or exceed the bikes while mounting weapons that can engage both ground targets and aircraft. Heavy bolters provide sustained fire against infantry and light vehicles, their ammunition feeds capable of maintaining fire for extended periods without reloading. Multi-meltas project beams of thermal energy that can melt through tank armor or reduce fortifications to slag, though their relatively short range requires speeder pilots to close with targets in ways that expose them to return fire. Assault cannons transform speeders into mobile weapons platforms capable of shredding entire squads with sustained rotary fire. The Ravenwing's aircraft component consists primarily of variants of the Nephilim jet fighter and the Dark Talon, specialized designs that exist nowhere else in the Imperium's arsenals. The Nephilim serves as an air superiority fighter, its twin Avenger mega bolters and last cannon providing the firepower necessary to engage both atmospheric aircraft and void-capable fighters that enter planetary airspace. The craft's engines allow it to operate effectively at both supersonic speeds and in the slower, more maneuverable flight regimes necessary for close air support. Ravenwing pilots train in tactics that emphasize hit-and-run attacks, diving on targets at maximum speed, delivering devastating fire, and climbing back to altitude before ground-based defenses can respond effectively. The Dark Talon represents something more specialized and considerably more sinister. This aircraft carries a rift cannon, a weapon that tears holes in reality itself, creating localized warp breaches that pull targets into the Imperium. The technology borders on heretical, utilizing principles that the Mechanicum barely understands, and that most tech priests would refuse to work with if they fully comprehended what the weapons do. The rift cannon fires projectiles that destabilize the barrier between real space and the warp, creating temporary portals through which the warp's energies pour into the material universe. Targets caught in these breaches experience effects that defy conventional description. Their physical forms are torn apart at the molecular level, their souls are exposed to entities that hunger for mortal essence, and the space they occupied becomes temporarily uninhabitable as warp energies dissipate back into the Imperium. The Dark Angels justify maintaining such weapons through the argument that hunting the fallen sometimes requires tools that match the horror of what they pursue. The Ravenwing's primary mission extends far beyond simple reconnaissance or fast attack operations. They serve as the chapter's intelligence gathering apparatus, the hunters who pursue rumors and half-confirmed reports about fallen sightings across the entire galaxy. When an interrogator chaplain extracts information from a captured fallen about the locations of other traitors, the Raven Wing deploys to investigate. When the chapter's network of informants reports suspicious activity that might indicate a fallen presence, the Raven Wing goes to ground. When the Unforgiven successor chapters request assistance tracking a lead they lack the resources to pursue themselves, the Raven Wing responds. This mission requires them to operate across vast distances, often far from the Rock or the main chapter fleet, conducting investigations that might last months or even years as they trace leads through multiple systems. The intelligence work the Raven Wing conducts would be familiar to any inquisitorial investigation team, though the Dark Angels would never acknowledge the comparison. They infiltrate populations to gather information, establish surveillance on suspected fallen or their associates, and conduct interrogations of individuals who might possess useful knowledge. The company maintains contacts throughout the Imperium, merchants who report unusual activities, administratum officials who provide access to shipping records and population data, and underworld figures who hear rumors that never reach official channels. These networks require constant maintenance and careful handling to prevent the Raven Wing's true purpose from becoming apparent to outsiders who might ask uncomfortable questions about why Space Marines are conducting investigations that seem to have no connection to the Imperium's military needs. When the Raven Wing confirms a fallen's location and determines that capture is feasible, they transition from intelligence gathering to direct action. The company's speed allows them to establish a cordon around the target area before the fallen realizes he has been discovered. Bike squadrons position themselves to block escape routes. Land speeders patrol approaches to prevent reinforcements from reaching the target, and aircraft maintain overwatch to engage any attempt at aerial escape. This cordon serves dual purposes. It prevents the fallen from fleeing before the Deathwing can deploy for the actual capture operation, and it keeps outside forces from interfering or witnessing what is about to occur. Imperial Guard units that happen to be operating in the area find themselves politely but firmly redirected away from the cordon zone. Civilian populations are evacuated under pretexts that range from impending Xenos attacks to environmental hazards, whatever story seems most likely to achieve compliance without raising suspicions. The Raven Wing's role in maintaining operational security during fallen captures sometimes requires them to take actions that would be considered criminal if committed by anyone outside the Adeptus Astartes. They have fired on Imperial forces that refused to withdraw from cordon zones, destroyed evidence that might reveal what they were hunting, and eliminated witnesses who saw too much during capture operations. These incidents are carefully managed to appear as accidents or the results of enemy action, with the Raven Wing's involvement obscured through misdirection and the destruction of records. The company's warriors understand that their mission's secrecy takes precedence over almost any other consideration, and they execute orders to eliminate witnesses with the same cold efficiency they bring to combat against the Imperium's conventional enemies. The Black Knights form the Raven Wing's inner circle, veterans who have been fully inducted into the knowledge of the fallen and who know the true purpose behind every hunt the company conducts. These warriors ride specialized Corvex pattern bikes, machines that incorporate technology recovered from the Dark Age and maintained by the chapter's most skilled tech marines. The Corvex bikes mount plasma talons, weapons that project bolts of superheated matter capable of melting through power armor or destroying light vehicles. The plasma technology makes these weapons temperamental and dangerous to their users. A containment failure can result in catastrophic feedback that kills the weapon's operator, but the Black Knights accept this risk in exchange for firepower that gives them decisive advantages in combat. The Black Knights serve as the Raven Wing's command element, and as specialists deployed when standard bike squadrons encounter resistance they cannot overcome through speed and mobility alone. They wear robes over their power armor black fabric that marks them as members of the inner circle, and that serves practical purposes in concealing their movements during reconnaissance operations. The robes also carry symbolic weight, visual links to the knightly traditions of Caliban that remind the Black Knights of the honor they defend and the shame they work to purge. Each Black Knight has proven himself through years of service in the Raven Wing, demonstrating not just martial skill, but also the psychological resilience necessary to carry the burden of truth while continuing to function as an effective warrior and leader. The process of induction into the Black Knights follows the same pattern as advancement to the Death Wing, though tailored to the Raven Wing's specific needs. A warrior who has served with distinction in the standard bike squadrons receives gradual revelations about the chapter's secrets, each piece of information accompanied by tests to ensure he can maintain operational security and continue to perform his duties. The final revelation, the complete truth about the Fallen and the betrayal on Caliban, comes only after the warrior has demonstrated absolute reliability. Some Ravenwing veterans never advance to the Black Knights despite their skill, lacking some quality that the company's leadership deems necessary for bearing the full weight of knowledge. These warriors continue to serve with honor in the standard squadrons, pursuing missions whose true purpose they understand only partially. The Black Knight's combat doctrine emphasizes aggressive shock assault, using their superior speed and firepower to break enemy formations before conventional forces can respond. They strike from unexpected directions, appear where intelligence suggested they could not be, and disappear before enemies can organize effective resistance. This approach works particularly well when hunting Fallen who have surrounded themselves with cultists or mercenary forces. The Black Knights can punch through these defensive screens, isolate the Fallen from his support, and hold him in place until the Deathwing arrives to conduct the actual capture. The Plasma Talons prove especially effective against traitor Astartes, their output calibrated to overwhelm the energy dissipation capabilities of power, armor, and force, Fallen to seek cover rather than stand and fight. The Ravenwing maintains its own support structure within the chapter, including Tech Marines who specialize in the maintenance of high-speed vehicles and apothecaries trained to treat injuries specific to mounted combat. The Tech Marines work constantly to keep the company's bikes and speeders operational, performing maintenance that ranges from routine oil changes and weapons calibration to complete engine rebuilds and the replacement of anti-grav systems damaged in combat. The work never ends. Every mission results in where that must be addressed. Every engagement produces damage that requires repair, and the demanding nature of high-speed operations means equipment failures that would be minor inconveniences for standard infantry can prove fatal for Ravenwing warriors. The company's Tech Marines have developed expertise that exceeds what most chapters possess, their knowledge of vehicle systems and high-speed combat engineering making them valuable resources that the chapter sometimes loans to successor chapters conducting their own hunts for the Fallen. The Ravenwing's operational tempo exceeds what most Space Marine companies maintain. While battle companies might spend months between major engagements, conducting training and maintenance during downtime, the Ravenwing operates almost continuously. There are always leads to investigate, rumors to track down, and surveillance operations to conduct. The company's warriors become accustomed to extended deployments far from the Rock, living out of their strike cruisers and conducting operations across multiple systems before returning to the Fortress Monastery for refit and reinforcement. This constant operational status creates wear not just on equipment, but on the warriors themselves. Ravenwing Marines develop a particular mindset, always alert for signs of Fallen presence, viewing every mission through the lens of whether it might provide intelligence useful for the hunt. The relationship between the Ravenwing and the Deathwing reflects the complementary nature of their missions. The second company finds the Fallen, confirms their locations, and establishes the conditions necessary for capture. The first company conducts the actual assault, deploying via teleportarium to seize targets before they can escape or be killed in the fighting. This division of labor requires extensive coordination and mutual trust. The Ravenwing must provide accurate intelligence and maintain their cordon despite whatever resistance they encounter, while the Deathwing must trust that the targets they are teleporting into are actually Fallen rather than cases of mistaken identity that could expose the chapter's secrets. The two companies train together regularly, conducting exercises that simulate fallen capture operations and refining the procedures through which they hand off missions from reconnaissance to assault. The Ravenwing's heraldry and iconography emphasize their role as hunters operating in the darkness. The company's color scheme consists entirely of black armor, a stark contrast to the dark green worn by the battle companies and the bone white of the Deathwing. This black serves practical purposes during reconnaissance operations, making Ravenwing warriors harder to spot during night operations or when they need to observe targets without being detected. The color also carries symbolic weight. The Ravenwing operates in the shadows of the chapter's history, hunting enemies whose very existence must remain secret, conducting a war that the Imperium cannot acknowledge. They are the darkness that hunts in darkness, pursuing traitors through a galaxy that must never learn what they are truly seeking. The second founding that followed the Horus Heresy saw the Dark Angels Legion divided into multiple chapters, a process mandated by the Codex Astartes that Robute Guilliman had written to prevent any single military leader from commanding the kind of force that could threaten the Imperium itself. The First Legion's gene seed created the Angels of Absolution, Angels of Redemption, and Angels of Vengeance, each inheriting not just the biological legacy of Lionel Johnson, but also the terrible burden of knowledge about the fallen. These successor chapters received their founding warriors from the original Legion, veterans who had fought during the Great Crusade and survived the heresy, and with those warriors came the complete truth about what had transpired on Caliban. The newly created chapters could not escape their heritage. They were dark angels in all but name, bound to the same mission of redemption and sworn to the same secrecy that defined their parent legion. The Angels of Absolution established their fortress monastery on the world of Allhallow, a planet located in Segmentum Obscurus that provided both strategic positioning for operations across the northern reaches of the Imperium and the isolation necessary for maintaining the secrets they carried. The chapter's founding cadre included warriors who had been present during the final battle on Caliban, veterans who witnessed firsthand the destruction of their homeworld and the scattering of the traitor garrison. These Marines brought with them not just combat experience, but also detailed knowledge of which of their brothers had turned traitor, information that formed the foundation of the chapter's contribution to the collective hunt. The Angels of Absolution maintain their own Deathwing and Ravenwing equivalents, though they designate these formations with different titles that reflect their chapter's particular interpretation of the redemptive mission. The theological position that gives the Angels of Absolution their name stems from their belief that the sins of the fallen belong to those individual traitors rather than being inherited by all dark angels. This interpretation provides psychological relief from the crushing guilt that characterizes the parent chapter's mindset, allowing the Angels of Absolution to function with a clarity that sometimes eludes their more shame-burdened cousins. They hunt the fallen with the same determination as the Dark Angels, but they do so viewing themselves as executors of justice rather than penitents seeking redemption for crimes they did not commit. This distinction might seem subtle to outsiders, but within the Unforgiven, it represents a significant philosophical divide. The Angels of Absolution's approach has occasionally created friction with the Dark Angels' leadership, particularly when the Supreme Grand Master expects levels of self-sacrifice that the Angels of Absolution consider unnecessary given their theological stance. The Angels of Redemption took a different path, establishing themselves on a fleet-based operational model that allows them to range across the galaxy in pursuit of their mission without being tied to a single world. Their fortress monastery exists aboard a massive battle barge that serves as both headquarters and mobile base of operations, supported by a fleet of strike cruisers and support vessels that provide the chapter with logistical independence. This organizational choice reflects the chapter's founding leadership's assessment that hunting the fallen would require maximum flexibility and the ability to respond to leads regardless of where they originated. The Angels of Redemption have developed expertise in void combat and boarding actions that exceeds even the Dark Angels' capabilities in these areas, their warriors training constantly in the close quarters fighting that characterizes ship-to-ship warfare. The chapter's name reflects an even more intense focus on the redemptive mission than the parent legion maintains. The Angels of Redemption view themselves as already damned by association with the fallen, believing that only through the complete eradication of every traitor can they hope to achieve salvation. This theological position creates warriors who fight with a desperation that borders on suicidal, accepting casualties that other chapters would consider unacceptable in pursuit of objectives related to the hunt. The Angels of Redemption have earned a reputation for ferocity that makes even other Unforgiven uncomfortable. Their willingness to sacrifice everything in pursuit of a single fallen, sometimes resulting in Pyrrhic victories where the target is captured, but entire squads are lost in the process. The Angels of Vengeance established their base of operations on the world of Vindictus, a planet whose name reflects the chapter's particular approach to their inherited mission. Where the Angels of Absolution seek justice and the Angels of Redemption pursue salvation through sacrifice, the Angels of Vengeance focus on retribution for the betrayal that occurred 10,000 years ago. Their fortress monastery incorporates design elements that deliberately echo the architecture of Alduruk, creating a physical reminder of what was lost when Caliban was destroyed. The chapter maintains extensive records of the original garrison's composition, tracking bloodlines and recruitment patterns to identify which Calibanic families produced warriors who turned traitor. This genealogical obsession serves no practical purpose in the hunt, but provides the Angels of Vengeance with a sense of historical continuity and connection to the events they work to avenge. The chapter's combat doctrine emphasizes overwhelming force applied with precision, their tactical planning reflecting a belief that the fallen deserve no mercy and should be given no opportunity to escape through half measures. When the Angels of Vengeance deploy to capture a fallen, they commit forces that exceed what the tactical situation strictly requires, surrounding targets with such overwhelming strength that resistance becomes futile. This approach has proven effective in preventing fallen from escaping or being killed during capture attempts, though it sometimes results in the chapter being unable to respond to multiple leads simultaneously due to having committed too many resources to single operations. The later founding chapters that carry Dark Angel's gene seed inherited the same burden despite being created millennia after the heresy. The consecrators, founded during an unspecified later founding, maintain traditions and equipment that suggest their founding cadre came directly from the Dark Angel's veteran companies. The chapter fields weapons and armor that date back to the Great Crusade era, relics that most chapters would display in their fortress monasteries' halls of honor, but that the consecrators deploy in active combat. Their tech marines have developed expertise in maintaining ancient technology that rivals the Mechanicum's own capabilities, keeping plasma weapons, Volkite chargers, and power armor patterns that predate the heresy in full operational status. The consecrators' obsession with preserving these relics extends beyond simple reverence for history. They view each piece of equipment as a physical link to the First Legion before the betrayal, tangible evidence of the honor that once defined the Dark Angels before Luther's treachery stained their reputation. The Guardians of the Covenant trace their lineage to a founding that occurred during the 32nd millennium, their creation authorized to provide additional space marine presence in regions where the Unforgiven's intelligence networks had identified increased fallen activity. The chapter established its fortress monastery, the Library of Sanctity, on the world of Mordecai 7, constructing a facility that serves simultaneously as military headquarters and repository for information related to the hunt. The Guardians of the Covenant maintain what may be the most extensive records of fallen sightings and capture operations outside the rock itself, their archivists compiling data from across the Unforgiven and analyzing patterns that might predict where traitors will emerge next. The chapter's leadership includes an unusually high proportion of librarians, psychic warriors, who use their abilities to search for traces of warp corruption that might indicate fallen presence, and who maintain astropathic communication networks that allow the Unforgiven to coordinate across vast distances. The Disciples of Caliban represent one of the more recently created chapters carrying Dark Angel's gene seed, founded during the 38th millennium to replace losses the Unforgiven had suffered during a particularly costly period of operations against both conventional enemies and the Fallen. The chapter's name reflects their commitment to preserving the traditions of their genetic heritage, and their fortress monastery incorporates recovered stones from Caliban itself, fragments of the destroyed world that the Dark Angels provided to emphasize the new chapter's connection to their shared history. The Disciples of Caliban have developed a reputation for aggressive pursuit of any light related to the Fallen, their relative youth as a chapter translating into an eagerness to prove themselves worthy of their heritage through success in the hunt. Each successor chapter maintains its own equivalents of the Deathwing and Ravenwing, though they employ different names and sometimes slight variations in organization or tactical doctrine. The Angels of Absolution's first company wears bone-white armor like the Deathwing, but calls itself the Guardians of Redemption, while their second company of bike-mounted warriors bears the title Sable Swords and wears black armor decorated with white trim that distinguishes them from the parent chapter's Ravenwing. The Angels of Redemption's elite formations use the titles Redeemed and Shadow Wardens, their terminology reflecting the chapter's particular theological interpretation of the redemptive mission. These naming differences serve practical purposes in maintaining each chapter's distinct identity while acknowledging their shared heritage and mission. The structure of the Unforgiven as a legion in all but name violates both the letter and spirit of the Codex Astartes. Guilliman's organizational framework was designed specifically to prevent the kind of coordination between chapters that the Dark Angels and their successors maintain. The Unforgiven operate under a command structure where the Dark Angel's Supreme Grand Master holds authority that extends across all the successor chapters, coordinating hunts that involve multiple chapters and directing resources in ways that treat the entire collective as a single military force. When a particularly dangerous Fallen is located, or when intelligence suggests multiple traitors are operating in proximity, the Supreme Grand Master can issue orders that deploy elements from several chapters simultaneously, creating strike forces that approach company or even battalion strength. This coordination requires communication networks that exist outside official Imperial channels. The Unforgiven maintain their own astropathic relay stations, facilities hidden on remote worlds or aboard ships that drift through uninhabited systems, staffed by psychers who have been inducted into enough of the truth to understand the importance of maintaining absolute security. These relay stations allow the chapters to communicate without their messages passing through the standard administratum networks, where inquisitors or other imperial authorities might intercept and analyze them. The encryption methods employed by Unforgiven astropaths utilize techniques that predate the Imperium itself, codes based on mathematical principles from the dark age of technology that resist conventional cryptanalysis. The Conclave of the Unforgiven represents the institutional framework through which this coordination occurs. These gatherings happen at irregular intervals, called when the Supreme Grand Master determines that direct consultation between chapter leadership is necessary. The conclaves take place aboard the Rock, or occasionally on neutral ground, when security concerns make traveling to the Dark Angel's fortress monastery inadvisable. Attendance includes the chapter masters of all Unforgiven chapters, or their designated representatives, along with the masters of each chapter's Deathwing and Ravenwing equivalents and senior interrogator chaplains. The gatherings last for days or sometimes weeks, during which the assembled leadership reviews intelligence about fallen locations, coordinates upcoming operations, and discusses strategic questions about how the hunt should proceed. The conclaves serve multiple purposes beyond simple operational coordination. They provide opportunities for interrogator chaplains to share techniques and insights gained from questioning captured fallen, allowing the Unforgiven to refine their interrogation methods based on collective experience. The gatherings include training sessions, where warriors from different chapters practice coordinated operations, ensuring that when multiple chapters deploy together, they can function as a unified force despite differences in their specific tactical doctrines. The conclaves also address the psychological burden that the hunt places on the Unforgiven, with chaplains conducting group counseling sessions that allow warriors to discuss the strain of maintaining their secrets with others who share the same burden. The security surrounding these conclaves exceeds anything employed for standard chapter meetings. The locations are kept secret until immediately before the gatherings begin, with participating chapters receiving final coordinates through encrypted communications that self-destruct after being read. The Rock's defenses reach maximum alert status during conclaves held aboard the Fortress Monastery, with the Deathwing establishing security perimeters and the Ravenwing conducting sweeps of the surrounding space to ensure no unauthorized vessels are present. Librarians maintain psychic wards that prevent scrying or astropathic eavesdropping, creating zones of psychic silence that make the conclave invisible to anyone attempting to observe it through warp-based means. The Watchers in the Dark emerge from the Rock's depths during these gatherings, their presence throughout the Fortress Monastery serving as additional security against threats that conventional measures might miss. The intelligence sharing that occurs during conclaves has proven crucial to the Unforgiven's success in capturing Fallen over the millennia. A lead that seems insignificant to one chapter might connect with information another chapter possesses, creating a complete picture that allows the Unforgiven to predict where a Fallen will appear next or identify patterns in how the traitors move through the galaxy. The Guardians of the Covenant's archivists present analyses of data collected since the previous conclave, identifying correlations and trends that suggest where investigative resources should be focused. The Angels of Redemption share intelligence gathered during their fleet-based operations, their constant movement across the galaxy providing them with access to information that chapters tied to specific regions might miss. The conclaves also address situations where the hunt has created complications with Imperial authorities. When Dark Angels or their successors have been forced to fire on Imperial forces to maintain operational security, the conclave reviews these incidents to determine whether the actions were justified and what steps need to be taken to prevent investigations. The Unforgiven maintain contacts throughout the Imperium's bureaucracy, individuals who can be influenced or bribed to misdirect inquiries or lose records that might prove problematic. During conclaves, the chapters coordinate these influence operations, ensuring that their collective efforts to manage their reputation remain consistent and that no single chapter's actions create vulnerabilities that could expose the entire Unforgiven. The question of what will happen when all the Fallen have been captured or killed occupies significant discussion during conclaves, though no consensus has emerged across 10,000 years of debate. Some argue that redemption will be achieved, and the Unforgiven can finally reveal their history without fear of consequences, their success in hunting down every traitor demonstrating their loyalty beyond question. Others believe the shame can never be fully purged, that the mere fact of the betrayal will stain the Dark Angel's reputation regardless of how thoroughly they prosecute the hunt. The most pessimistic voices suggest that the hunt itself has become the point, that the Unforgiven have built their entire identity around pursuing the Fallen and would face an existential crisis if that mission ever actually concluded. The successor chapters' relationships with their parent legion vary in warmth and closeness. The Angels of Absolution maintain somewhat distant ties, their theological differences creating friction that prevents the complete unity of purpose the Supreme Grand Master sometimes desires. The Angels of Vengeance operate in close coordination with the Dark Angels, their shared emphasis on retribution creating natural alignment in tactical and strategic thinking. The Guardians of the Covenant serve as information brokers for the entire Unforgiven, their role in collecting and analyzing intelligence making them indispensable despite their relatively small size compared to other chapters. These varying relationships create internal politics within the Unforgiven that the conclaves must navigate, balancing the needs of the collective hunt against each chapter's particular priorities and interpretations of their shared mission. The Unforgiven's gene seed remains remarkably pure despite 10,000 years of replication and implantation. The biological legacy that Lionel Johnson provided to his legion has proven stable and resistant to the mutations that plague some other bloodlines. This purity allows the Unforgiven to maintain recruitment rates that keep their chapters at or near full strength, providing the manpower necessary for both their obligations to the Imperium and their secret war against the Fallen. The apothecaries who oversee gene seed cultivation and implantation guard their charges with fanatical devotion, understanding that any corruption of the bloodline would represent a betrayal of the Primarch's legacy that would compound the shame the chapters already carry. The Pandarax campaign stands as one of the most complex operations the Dark Angels have prosecuted in recent Imperial history, a conflict where Supreme Grand Master Azrael found himself commanding forces against a demonic incursion while simultaneously coordinating a covert hunt for Fallen who had been detected within the same war zone. The campaign began in the year 959 of the 41st millennium, when the demon prince Corpulax, a former Death Guard Astartes elevated to demonhood during the heresy, led an invasion of the Pandarax system. The world of Pythos, a mining colony that had been corrupted by chaos cults operating in secret for generations, became the focal point of fighting that would draw in forces from across the Imperium. The Grey Knights deployed multiple brotherhoods to combat the demonic threat, their specialized training and psychic abilities making them the obvious choice for prosecuting a war against entities that conventional forces could barely harm. Azrael's decision to commit significant Dark Angels resources to Pandarax raised questions among Imperial commanders who wondered why the First Legion would involve itself so heavily in a campaign that already had dedicated demon-hunting specialists present. The Supreme Grand Master cited the chapter's obligations to the Imperium and the severity of the demonic threat, explanations that satisfied most inquiries but masked the true reason for the Dark Angels' presence. Intelligence gathered by the Ravenwing had identified at least 3 Fallen operating within Corpulax's forces, traitor Dark Angels who had aligned themselves with Chaos and now commanded warbands of cultists and renegade Astartes. The opportunity to capture multiple Fallen in a single operation was too valuable to ignore, even if it meant deploying into a war zone where the Dark Angels' actions would be observed by the Grey Knights, warriors whose psychic abilities and investigative training made them potentially dangerous witnesses to anything unusual. The Dark Angels established their command post in the ruins of Attica, one of Pythos' primary hive cities that had been partially destroyed during the initial demon assault. From this position, Azrael coordinated both the official campaign against Corpulax's forces and the covert hunt for the Fallen, a balancing act that required him to maintain the appearance of full cooperation with allied forces while secretly diverting resources to objectives that had nothing to do with the demonic incursion. The Supreme Grand Master assigned specific units to track the Fallen's movements through the war zone, using the chaos of battle as cover for reconnaissance operations that would have seemed inexplicable if their true purpose had been known. Ravenwing squadrons ranged across Pythos' ash wastes and through the ruins of its hive cities, ostensibly conducting reconnaissance for the main Imperial force, but actually searching for signs of the traitor Dark Angels. The campaign's complexity increased when one of the Fallen, a former sergeant named Varial, who had turned to Nurgle worship during his centuries in the Warp, led a warband in an assault on an Imperial Guard position that the Dark Angels had been ordered to reinforce. Azrael faced an immediate tactical dilemma. Allowing the Guard position to fall would result in Imperial casualties and potentially compromise the wider campaign, but committing forces to its defense risked killing Varial in the fighting rather than capturing him alive for interrogation. The Supreme Grand Master made the decision to reinforce the Guard position with sufficient strength to hold it, while simultaneously deploying Deathwing Terminators via teleportarium to isolate Varial from his warband. The operation succeeded in capturing the Fallen, but the extraction required the Dark Angels to abandon their positions defending the Guard forces at a critical moment, resulting in casualties that could have been prevented if the Astartes had maintained their commitment to the defensive line. The Grey Knights noticed these tactical inconsistencies, their battle leaders questioning why Dark Angel's units would withdraw from positions they had been holding successfully, or why certain objectives that seemed strategically insignificant received disproportionate attention from Azrael's forces. Brother Captain Epimetheus, who commanded one of the Grey Knights' brotherhoods deployed to Pandarax, personally approached Azrael to discuss coordination between their forces and to inquire about the Dark Angel's operational priorities. The Supreme Grand Master deflected these questions through a combination of appeals to chapter sovereignty and references to intelligence he claimed to possess about chaos force dispositions that required the Dark Angels to operate with tactical flexibility. Epimetheus accepted these explanations, though reports suggest he remained suspicious about what the Dark Angels were truly pursuing on Pythos. The hunt for the other two fallen continued throughout the campaign, complicated by the fact that they had integrated themselves into Corpulax's command structure deeply enough that isolating them for capture without alerting the Demon Prince proved extremely difficult. One of the traitors, a former librarian who had developed significant psychic powers during his time serving Chaos, maintained position near Corpulax himself, serving as an advisor and sorcerer whose abilities contributed to the Demon Prince's tactical planning. The Dark Angels could not simply teleport Deathwing into Corpulax's headquarters. The psychic wards and demonic entities protecting the location would have destroyed any force attempting such an assault. Instead, Azrael coordinated a series of operations designed to draw Corpulax's forces into engagements that would separate the fallen librarian from his patron, creating opportunities for capture that never quite materialized before the Demon Prince recognized the pattern and adjusted his dispositions. The campaign reached its climax when combined Imperial forces assaulted the Damnation Cache, a facility where Corpulax had been conducting rituals designed to tear open a permanent warp rift that would transform Pythos into a demon world. The Grey Knights led the assault, their psychic abilities and blessed weapons making them the only Imperial forces capable of fighting effectively in the warp-saturated environment around the cache. The Dark Angels participated in the assault, ostensibly to provide support and additional combat power, but Azrael's actual priority remained capturing the Fallen. During the final battle, when Grey Knights engaged Corpulax directly, and Imperial Guard regiments fought to hold defensive positions against waves of demons and cultists, the Dark Angels deployed Deathwing and Ravenwing elements in what appeared to be a flanking maneuver, but was actually a capture operation targeting the fallen librarian who had become separated from Corpulax during the fighting. The capture succeeded, but the cost included the collapse of an Imperial Guard defensive line that the Dark Angels had been assigned to support. An entire regiment, the Catachan 183rd, was overrun and destroyed when the Dark Angels withdrew to extract their captured fallen. The official after-action reports attributed the regiment's destruction to overwhelming enemy pressure and the unpredictable nature of fighting in warp-saturated environments, explanations that satisfied most Imperial authorities, but that survivors from supporting units knew were incomplete. Catachan veterans who had been positioned adjacent to where the Dark Angels had been fighting reported that the Astartes had simply disappeared at the moment when their support was most needed, leaving the 183rd exposed to a demonic assault they could not withstand. The third Fallen escaped capture during the Pandarax campaign, disappearing when Corpulax's forces retreated after the Demon Prince's banishment. The Dark Angels conducted extensive searches across Pythos in the campaign's aftermath, operations that continued long after other Imperial forces had withdrawn from the system. These searches disrupted the planet's reconstruction efforts and created friction with the Administratum officials who had been assigned to oversee Pythos's return to Imperial compliance. The Dark Angels ignored complaints about their continued presence, citing ongoing security concerns and the need to ensure no chaos taint remained on the world. The real searches focused on any trace of where the escaped Fallen might have gone, interrogations of captured cultists who might have information about the traitor's movements, and investigations into whether any ships had departed Pythos during the final stages of fighting that could have carried the Fallen to other systems. The Pandarax campaign exemplified the operational tensions that define the Dark Angels' prosecution of wars where their dual objectives conflict. Azrael had to maintain the appearance of full commitment to the Imperial war effort while secretly prioritizing objectives related to the Fallen hunt. He made decisions that resulted in Imperial casualties, diverted resources from strategically important operations to pursue targets whose significance he could not explain to Allied commanders, and conducted operations whose true purpose had to remain hidden from forces fighting alongside his chapter. The Grey Knight's presence complicated everything, their psychic abilities and investigative training making them dangerous observers who might notice inconsistencies that other Imperial forces would miss. The campaign succeeded in its official objective. Corpulax was banished, and Pythos was saved from becoming a demon world, but it also demonstrated how the Dark Angels' obsession with the Fallen could compromise their effectiveness in conventional military operations. The pattern of abandoning Imperial forces during critical battles when Fallen are detected has repeated itself across 10,000 years of Dark Angels operations, creating a reputation for unreliability that the chapter cannot effectively counter without revealing why they sometimes withdraw from combat. During the Vraxian Crusade, a Dark Angels strike force that had been providing crucial support to Death Corps of Krieg regiments assaulting a fortress complex suddenly withdrew without explanation, leaving the Kriegers to complete the assault without Astartes' support. The withdrawal occurred because Ravenwing Reconnaissance had identified a Fallen operating 3 systems away, intelligence that required immediate response before the target could disappear. The Death Corps completed their assault successfully despite the Dark Angels' absence, but casualties were significantly higher than projections had suggested they would be with continued Astartes support. The chapter of the Howling Griffins filed formal complaints with the Administratum after Dark Angels' forces abandoned a joint operation on the world of Honorum without warning or explanation. The 2 chapters had been conducting a coordinated assault against an Orc warband, with the Howling Griffins advancing on the Greenskins' primary stronghold, while the Dark Angels secured flanking positions that would prevent Orc reinforcements from reaching the battle. The Dark Angels withdrew from their positions abruptly, redeploying their entire force to orbit and departing the system within hours. The Howling Griffins found themselves facing Orc counterattacks from directions the Dark Angels should have been covering, forcing them to abandon their assault and withdraw to defensive positions. The Dark Angels never provided explanation for their departure, and the Howling Griffins chapter master sent multiple requests for clarification that went unanswered. The incident damaged relationships between the chapters in ways that have never been fully repaired, with the Howling Griffins learning to view Dark Angels' commitments to joint operations as provisional at best. These abandonments create operational challenges for Imperial commanders who must account for the possibility that Dark Angels' forces might disappear without warning. Some Lord Generals have refused to accept Dark Angels' support for their campaigns, preferring to operate without Astartes' assistance rather than risk having their plans disrupted by sudden withdrawals. Others build contingency plans that assume Dark Angels units will not be available at critical moments, essentially treating the chapter's commitments as unreliable and planning operations accordingly. These adaptations work against the Imperium's military effectiveness, forcing conventional forces to operate with less support than they should have and creating situations where campaigns take longer or cost more lives than would be necessary if the Dark Angels could be relied upon to maintain their commitments. The Inquisition maintains extensive documentation of incidents where Dark Angels have behaved in ways that suggest they prioritize unknown objectives over the Imperium's strategic needs. Inquisitor Bastilic Grimm spent 3 decades investigating the Dark Angels' operational patterns, analyzing after-action reports, and interviewing survivors from campaigns where the chapter had been present. His findings, compiled in a report that remains classified at the highest levels of inquisitorial authority, documented dozens of incidents where Dark Angel's forces had abandoned positions, withdrawn from battles, or diverted resources to objectives that made no apparent strategic sense. Grimm's conclusion stopped short of accusing the Dark Angels of heresy, but he recommended that the chapter be placed under formal investigation to determine what they were truly pursuing with such single-minded determination that they would compromise Imperial military operations. Grimm's investigation ended when he disappeared while traveling to a meeting with other Inquisitors who had expressed interest in his findings. His ship was found drifting in the void, its crew dead and all records related to his Dark Angel's investigation missing. The official determination attributed the incident to pirate attack, though no pirates were ever identified, and the pattern of damage to the ship suggested it had been boarded by forces using equipment consistent with Astartes' assault operations. Other Inquisitors who had been working with Grimm received his compiled data through dead drop protocols he had established, ensuring that his findings survived even though he did not. The Dark Angels have never been formally connected to Grimm's death, but Inquisitors who investigate the Chapter 2 closely have learned to take precautions that assume they are operating under observation by forces that possess both the capability and willingness to eliminate threats to whatever secrets the First Legion guards. The purging of worlds where fallen presence was discovered represents the most extreme measures the Dark Angels have taken to preserve their secrets. The world of Stern's Remembrance, a minor agri-world in the Segmentum Pacificus, was subjected to exterminatus after Dark Angels discovered that a fallen had been operating there for decades, building a cult following among the planetary population. The chapter deployed significant forces to Stern's Remembrance under the pretense of investigating reports of heretical activity, which was technically accurate even if the specific nature of that heresy remained classified. The Dark Angels conducted operations across the planet for weeks, eliminating cult cells and searching for the fallen who had created them. When they finally cornered their target, the confrontation took place in the planetary capital, where thousands of civilians witnessed Space Marines fighting what appeared to be another Space Marine wearing similar armor. The decision to purge Stern's Remembrance came from the Supreme Grand Master after receiving reports about how many witnesses had observed the battle. Civilian populations had seen enough to ask questions about why Space Marines were fighting each other, and the Dark Angels could not allow those questions to spread beyond the planet. The chapter evacuated its own forces and then authorized orbital bombardment that sterilized Stern's Remembrance's surface, killing every human on the planet to ensure no witnesses survived. The official records attributed the exterminatus to chaos corruption that had spread too far to be contained through conventional means, an explanation that satisfied most Imperial authorities, but that left some administratum officials questioning why the Dark Angels had not requested inquisitorial assistance if corruption had been so severe. Similar purgings have occurred on other worlds, where the Dark Angels determined that too many witnesses had seen evidence of fallen presence. The Hive world of Perditions Gate lost an entire Hive city to Dark Angels' bombardment after civilians witnessed a battle between the chapter and what they described as traitor Space Marines wearing dark green armor. The Dark Angels cordoned off the Hive, prevented anyone from leaving, and then subjected it to sustained fire that reduced the structure to rubble and killed millions. The chapter's official explanation cited a genestealer infestation that required immediate and total response, though no evidence of Tyrannid presence was ever documented by other Imperial authorities who investigated the incident afterward. The administratum accepted the explanation because challenging it would require accusing the Dark Angels of lying, an action that could trigger conflicts between Imperial institutions that the administratum preferred to avoid. The willingness to sacrifice Imperial forces and assets to preserve secrecy extends beyond simply abandoning allies during battles. The Dark Angels have destroyed evidence that might reveal the Fallen's existence, actions that sometimes include eliminating Imperial personnel who possess that evidence. An administratum audit team investigating supply discrepancies in the Ghoul Star's region discovered records suggesting that a Space Marine matching Dark Angel's description had been operating in the area centuries earlier during a period when no official Dark Angels deployments had occurred. The audit team's ship disappeared while returning to their sector headquarters, lost with all hands in what official records attributed to warp travel mishap. The Dark Angels were never connected to the incident, but the timing of the disappearance, occurring immediately after the audit team had transmitted preliminary findings to their superiors, suggested intervention by forces that wanted those findings suppressed. Conflicts with the Inquisition represent the most dangerous situations the Dark Angels face in maintaining their secrets. Inquisitors possess authority that theoretically supersedes chapter sovereignty, and their investigative resources can uncover information that the Dark Angels work desperately to keep hidden. The chapter has developed protocols for managing inquisitorial attention, methods that range from cooperation, designed to misdirect investigations away from sensitive areas, to more direct interventions when inquisitors get too close to discovering the truth. These protocols recognize that killing an inquisitor creates problems that often exceed the benefits, but they also acknowledge that some situations require permanent solutions, regardless of the complications they create. Inquisitor Ciaro of the Ordo Hereticus came dangerously close to discovering the truth about the Fallen during an investigation into suspected chaos infiltration of imperial institutions in the Segmentum Obscurus. Her investigation had identified patterns suggesting that someone was manipulating imperial records and communications across multiple sectors, alterations that seemed designed to hide the movements of specific individuals. Ciaro's analysis led her to conclude that Space Marines were involved in whatever conspiracy she had uncovered, and she began focusing her investigation on chapters operating in the affected regions. The Dark Angels became subjects of her inquiry when she noticed that many of the record alterations occurred in systems where the chapter had recently been present. Ciaro requested permission to inspect the rock and interview Dark Angels leadership about their operations in the regions where she had detected anomalies. The Supreme Grand Master denied her request, citing chapter privileges and operational security concerns that prevented him from allowing inquisitorial access to the Fortress Monastery. Ciaro responded by escalating her investigation, using her authority to compel cooperation from administratum officials and Imperial Guard commanders who had worked with the Dark Angels. The information she gathered reinforced her suspicions that the chapter was hiding something significant, though she had not yet determined what that something was. Her investigation reports, transmitted to other inquisitors in her ordo, speculated about possibilities ranging from chaos corruption within the chapter to secret alliances with Xeno's forces. The situation resolved when Ciaro died during an investigation on a different world, killed by cultists who ambushed her retinue during a raid on a suspected heretical gathering. The official reports documented the ambush in detail, describing how the cultists had been better prepared than intelligence had suggested, and how they had specifically targeted the Inquisitor with weapons that penetrated her protective wards. Other Inquisitors who reviewed the incident found nothing obviously suspicious about how Ciaro had died, though some noted that the cultists had demonstrated tactical capabilities and equipment access that seemed unusual for a group that should have been a minor local threat. The Dark Angels were never connected to Ciaro's death, but her investigation into the chapter ended with her, and the Inquisitors who inherited her cases chose to focus their attention on other matters rather than continuing to pursue leads that had gotten their colleague killed. The Dark Angels entered the 41st millennium as one of the Imperium's most enigmatic chapters, their reputation built on 10,000 years of military excellence, shadowed by an obsessive secrecy that made even other Space Marines uncomfortable. The chapter maintained strength levels that suggested they had suffered fewer losses than their operational tempo should have produced, a statistical anomaly that some Imperial analysts attributed to superior tactics and equipment, while others viewed as evidence of record manipulation designed to obscure the true state of the chapter's forces. The Dark Angels fielded approximately 1,000 battle brothers across their companies, supported by extensive fleets and the mobile fortress monastery of the Rock that gave them strategic mobility unmatched by chapters tied to planetary bases. Their successor chapters added thousands more warriors to the Unforgiven's collective strength, creating a force that operated as a legion in everything but official designation. The chapter's reputation among Imperial forces reflected the contradictions inherent in their dual mission. Military commanders recognized the Dark Angels as elite warriors whose combat effectiveness in conventional operations ranked among the highest in the Adeptus Astartes. Their Deathwing could break defensive positions that would stop other chapters. Their Raven Wing conducted reconnaissance and rapid strikes with precision that other formations struggled to match, and their battle companies prosecuted campaigns with the methodical thoroughness that had characterized the First Legion since the Great Crusade. Yet this military excellence existed alongside a pattern of unexplained withdrawals, abandoned operations, and refusals to coordinate with allied forces that created friction wherever the Dark Angels deployed. Imperial Guard generals learned to build contingency plans that assumed Dark Angel support might vanish without warning, while other Space Marine chapters approached joint operations with the First Legion's successors, with wariness born from past experiences of being left unsupported at critical moments. The Inquisition's interest in the Dark Angels had intensified throughout the 41st millennium as investigators accumulated evidence of behavioral patterns that suggested the chapter prioritized unknown objectives over the Imperium's strategic needs. Multiple Inquisitors had attempted comprehensive investigations into what the Dark Angels were truly pursuing, and several of those investigators had died under circumstances that raised more questions than they answered. The Ordo Hereticus maintained classified files documenting incidents where Dark Angels had fired on Imperial forces, destroyed evidence without explanation, or conducted operations that seemed designed to suppress information rather than prosecute military objectives. These files never accumulated into formal charges of heresy or treason, but they created an atmosphere of suspicion that the Dark Angels could not dispel without revealing the truths they worked so desperately to conceal. The opening of the Great Rift in the closing years of the 41st millennium transformed the strategic situation across the entire galaxy. The massive warp storm that tore through real space from the Eye of Terror to the Hadex anomaly divided the Imperium into two distinct regions, with the Northern Imperium Nihilus cut off from Terra and the Astronomican's guiding light. Warp travel became even more dangerous than usual, with ships taking months or years to complete journeys that should have required weeks, and astropathic communication became sporadic as the warp's turbulence interfered with psychic transmission. The Dark Angels found their operations complicated by these disruptions, their ability to coordinate with successor chapters hampered by communication difficulties, and their pursuit of the Fallen made more challenging by warp conditions that allowed traitors to move between systems with less risk of detection. The Fallen themselves became more active in the wake of the Great Rift's opening, emerging from hiding in numbers that suggested coordinated planning rather than random chance. Luther, the architect of the original betrayal, who had been held in the Rock's deepest dungeons for 10,000 years, escaped during the chaos that accompanied the warp storm's formation. The circumstances of his escape remained unclear even to the Dark Angel's leadership, with reports suggesting that the Rock's deepest levels had been breached by entities that should not have been able to penetrate the fortress monastery's defenses. Luther's freedom represented a catastrophic failure of security that had implications extending far beyond the loss of a single prisoner. He possessed complete knowledge of the Fallen's origins and could potentially unite the scattered traitors into a coordinated force that would be exponentially more dangerous than individuals operating independently. Cypher's activities increased during this period as well, the enigmatic figure appearing at critical moments across the galaxy in ways that suggested he possessed knowledge of events before they occurred. This mysterious warrior wore the robes and bore the weapons of the Lord Cypher, the position Luther had once held as keeper of Caliban's traditions, but his true identity remained unknown even to the Dark Angels who had pursued him for millennia. Cypher moved through the Imperium with apparent freedom despite being one of the most wanted individuals in the galaxy, his actions following patterns that made no obvious sense to those who tracked him. He had been seen fighting against Chaos forces in some instances, and alongside them in others, had saved Imperial worlds from destruction and led attacks against Imperial installations, and had repeatedly demonstrated abilities that suggested he possessed resources and knowledge that a lone fugitive should not have been able to access. The return of Robute Guilliman to active command of Imperial forces created new complications for the Dark Angels and their secret war. The Lord Commander of the Imperium brought with him Primaris Space Marines, a new generation of Astartes created using improved gene seed and enhanced implantation procedures that produced warriors larger and more powerful than standard Space Marines. Guilliman authorized the distribution of Primaris reinforcements to all chapters, including the Dark Angels and their successors, presenting Supreme Grand Master Azrael with warriors who possessed no knowledge of the Fallen or the shame that drove the Unforgiven's mission. These new Marines had been created on Mars and indoctrinated with standard Imperial ideology that portrayed all Space Marine chapters as loyal defenders of humanity, leaving them completely unprepared for the revelation that thousands of their genetic brothers had turned traitor 10,000 years ago. The integration of Primaris Marines into the Dark Angels' command structure required careful management to prevent the new warriors from discovering the truth before they were ready to bear that burden. The chapter's leadership assigned Primaris Marines to battle companies where they could be observed and evaluated, keeping them away from operations directly related to hunting the Fallen until their loyalty and psychological resilience could be assessed. This created a two-tier system within the chapter, with traditional Marines who knew varying levels of truth about the Fallen working, alongside Primaris Marines who remained ignorant of the secret that defined their chapter's existence. The situation generated tensions that the chaplains had to manage carefully, as traditional Marines sometimes resented the presence of warriors who had been gifted enhanced capabilities without having to earn them through the trials that defined the Dark Angels' recruitment process. The Primaris Marines themselves noticed inconsistencies in how the chapter operated, observing the same patterns of unexplained withdrawals and mysterious operations that had made the Dark Angels objects of suspicion among other Imperial forces. Some Primaris warriors began asking questions about why certain missions received priority over seemingly more important operations, or why the chapter maintained such extensive intelligence networks focused on tracking individuals rather than conventional threats. The chapter's leadership responded to these questions with the same deflections and partial truths that had been used for millennia, providing explanations that satisfied some Primaris Marines while leaving others increasingly suspicious that they were not being told the complete truth about their chapter's mission and history. The awakening of Lionel Johnson from his 10,000-year slumber represented a development that none of the Unforgiven had dared hope for, a miracle that changed everything about their situation while simultaneously creating new uncertainties about the future. The Primarch had lain in stasis within the deepest chambers of the rock since the Watchers in the Dark had dragged him there after his battle with Luther, his body suspended in a healing sleep while the chapter searched for him across millennia without success. The exact circumstances of his awakening remain known only to the Watchers and to the Lion himself, but he emerged into the rock's depths during the chaos of the Great Rift's opening, his wounds healed and his strength restored after 10,000 years of unconsciousness. The Lion's initial actions after awakening demonstrated that he retained the tactical brilliance and strategic vision that had made him one of the Emperor's most effective military commanders during the Great Crusade. He moved through the rock's passages without being detected by the chapter's security systems, observing his sons and evaluating the state of the Imperium into which he had awakened. What he saw troubled him deeply. The Imperium had become a stagnant theocracy that worshipped his father as a god, a development that contradicted everything the Emperor had claimed to stand for during the Great Crusade. The Space Marines had been divided into chapters that operated independently rather than as unified legions, and his own sons had become obsessed with hunting traitors to the point where that mission sometimes took precedence over defending humanity from its enemies. The Lion eventually revealed himself to Azrael and the Inner Circle, a meeting that occurred in the deepest chambers of the rock where the Primarch had been sleeping. The Supreme Grand Master and his senior officers fell to their knees before their Gene Father, overwhelmed by the presence of a being they had believed lost forever. The Lion's response to learning about the 10,000 years that had passed since Caliban's destruction and the extent of his chapter's obsession with the Fallen was complex. He understood why his sons had kept the betrayal secret, recognizing that revealing the truth could have resulted in the chapter's destruction. But he also saw how that secrecy had warped the Dark Angels into a force that sometimes acted against the Imperium's interests in pursuit of their private war. The Primarch made clear that things would change under his leadership, that the hunt for the Fallen would continue, but not at the expense of the chapter's primary obligation to defend humanity. The Lion's emergence from the rock into the wider Imperium occurred during the Arcs of Omen campaign, a period when Abaddon the Despoiler was prosecuting a new offensive, using massive space hulks as mobile fortresses. The Primarch led Dark Angel's forces in battles across multiple sectors, his presence on the battlefield inspiring his sons to feats of valor that reminded older Imperial citizens of stories from the Great Crusade. He fought with the Emperor's shield, a weapon he had carried during humanity's expansion across the galaxy, and wore armor that had been maintained in the rock's armories for 10 millennia against the possibility of his return. The Lion's tactical approach combined the methodical thoroughness that had characterized his campaigns during the Heresy with adaptations to the changed strategic situation he now faced, demonstrating that 10,000 years of sleep had not dulled his military genius. The Primarch's return created immediate complications for the Dark Angel's relationship with the wider Imperium, and with Roboute Guilliman specifically. The two Primarchs had never been close during the Great Crusade, their personalities and approaches to warfare differing in ways that prevented the kind of brotherhood that existed between some of their brothers. Guilliman had advocated for the Codex Astartes and the division of the legions, reforms that the Lion now saw had been necessary to prevent another heresy, but that had also weakened the Imperium's military capabilities in ways that 10,000 years of subsequent history had made apparent. The Lord Commander of the Imperium welcomed his brother's return and recognized the value of having another loyal Primarch active during the Imperium's darkest hour, but tensions existed between them about how the Imperium should be governed and how its military forces should be organized. The Lion's approach to the Fallen differed from the obsessive secrecy that had characterized the Dark Angel's hunt for 10 millennia. The Primarch understood that some of the warriors who had fought on Caliban had been misled rather than genuinely corrupted, that Luther's rebellion had caught up Marines who were guilty of poor judgment rather than deliberate treason. He began making distinctions between Fallen who had fully embraced chaos and those who had simply been on the wrong side during the Civil War, offering the possibility of redemption to traitors who demonstrated genuine remorse for their actions. This approach created friction with elements of the Inner Circle who had spent their entire lives believing that all Fallen were irredeemable traitors who deserved only death, but the Primarch's authority was absolute, and his sons ultimately accepted his judgment even when they disagreed with his mercy. The Lion's reunification with Luther represented one of the most emotionally complex moments in the chapter's history. The Primarch tracked down his former brother and closest friend, finding him leading a warband of Fallen who had gathered under his leadership after his escape from the rock. The confrontation between them occurred on a world whose name the Dark Angels have not revealed, a meeting that lasted for hours and involved both combat and conversation as the two warriors who had once been inseparable tried to reconcile 10,000 years of separation and betrayal. The details of what passed between them remain known only to the Lion himself, but Luther survived the encounter and the Primarch brought him back to the Rock not as a prisoner, but as something more complicated, a penitent who had finally acknowledged the magnitude of his crimes and sought redemption for sins that could never be fully absolved. The future of the Unforgiven's quest for redemption remains uncertain, with their Primarch returned to lead them. The Lion has made clear that the hunt for the fallen will continue, but it will no longer consume the chapter to the point where they compromise their effectiveness in defending the Imperium. He has begun integrating Primaris Marines into all levels of the chapter's command structure, inducting promising warriors into the inner circle more quickly than traditional practices would have allowed, and sharing the truth about the fallen with those he judges ready to bear that knowledge. The Primarch has also reached out to the successor chapters, re-establishing the connections between the Unforgiven in ways that acknowledge their shared heritage while respecting each chapter's independence and unique traditions. The Lion's presence has transformed the Dark Angels from a chapter haunted by shame into a force that can confront its past while focusing on the present's demands. The Primarch leads his sons in battles against the Imperium's enemies with the same skill that made him legendary during the Great Crusade, but he does so with an understanding of the Imperium's current state that allows him to adapt his strategies to circumstances that would have been unimaginable 10,000 years ago. He fights alongside Guilliman when their objectives align, coordinates with other Space Marine chapters without the suspicious secrecy that characterized the Dark Angel's previous approach to joint operations, and prosecutes campaigns with a focus on achieving strategic objectives rather than pursuing personal vendettas against traitors who turned against the Imperium millennia before most current Imperial citizens were born. The Watchers in the Dark continue their mysterious service to the chapter, their presence throughout the Rock suggesting they approve of the Lion's return and his approach to leading the Unforgiven. These enigmatic beings have been seen more frequently since the Primarch's awakening, appearing at moments when their guidance or intervention proves crucial to Operation success. The Lion treats the Watchers with a familiarity that suggests he understands their nature and purpose in ways that even the inner circle does not, though he has not shared that understanding with his sons. The Primarch's relationship with these mysterious entities represents one of many secrets he carries from the Great Crusade era, knowledge that may prove crucial to the Imperium's survival during the desperate wars of the era Indomitus. The Dark Angels and their successor chapters face a future that differs fundamentally from the 10,000 years that preceded their Primarch's return. They remain the First Legion in spirit, if not in organization, warriors who carry the distinction of being the Emperor's original Space Marines, and the burden of knowing that some of their brothers betrayed everything they were created to defend. The hunt for the fallen continues, but it no longer defines the Unforgiven to the exclusion of all other considerations. The Lion has given his sons permission to be more than hunters of traitors, to embrace their role as defenders of humanity without the constant weight of shame that had threatened to crush them under its burden. The chapter moves forward into an uncertain future, with their Gene Father leading them, ready to face whatever threats emerge from the galaxy's darkness, with the confidence that comes from having one of the Emperor's own sons commanding their forces in battle.